it's fun. And this is the end of our final presentations. Are we ready, Ludo, here? Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's online symposium entitled From Auto to Architecture, Setting a Course. This will serve, this is serving as an initial encounter with the intersections of car design and architecture, ranging from the intimacy of the car to the expanse of the city. It is the first of a series of events that we are organizing on the occasion of the Berlage's research project entitled The Auto Drives Architecture, which will be the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment at the TU Delft's contribution to a forthcoming exhibition opening in spring of 2022. We've invited what we consider a very formidable list of speakers to engage with us. Transdisciplinary speakers, in fact, coming from the different realms in thinking about what are the potential relationships between car design and architecture. It's a pleasure to welcome Gabrielle Esperdy, who is a professor of architecture at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. She is the author of American Autotopia, a very lovely book which examines how the automobile influenced architecture and urban design discourse in the United States from the earliest days of the car industry to the aftermath of the oil crisis of the 1970s. We really wanted to kick off today with a sort of big picture overview of how the car has influenced discourse in the last 50 years, not only within the United States, but also beyond. So Gabrielle has had a long-standing engagement with this kind of thinking, where not only did she publish the book, but she also has a wonderful blog and is a great admirer of the car. And well, at any rate, Gabrielle, thank you again for accepting the invitation from waking up a little bit earlier in New York City to kick off with our symposium today. So the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and good morning from New York. It's rather humid here, so I didn't wear de rigueur black. So I'm a bit of an outlier. I apologize. I know you won't judge me because of that. Let me just share here, and then we'll get going. Is that nice and visible to everyone? Great. Thank you again. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be a part of the symposium. And I'm also delighted to be able to offer a kind of overview that hopefully will touch upon a number of the issues that Salomon mentioned in his introduction. As he said, I've been working on this topic for perhaps far too long. And while I am an admirer of the automobile, I am not an apologist for the automobile, just to kind of get the political out there. So greetings from Autotopia. I'm going to talk today about cars, drivers, and the discourse of architecture. I could go on about this for hours, so I've tried to jam a lot of information and ideas into what I hope is a very compact presentation. Again, greetings from Autotopia. We have a tendency to think about the automobile in the middle of the 20th century relative to questions of sprawl and pollution and urban chaos, as is sort of represented in this pseudo vintage postcard that I wasted time on last year. But what I want to do today is to propose what we might describe as an alternative history, a history of the automobile and its relationship to architecture and urbanism that is not predicated purely on negativity, but in fact tries to look at another dimension in which there was a moment in which architects and urban designers continued to be optimistic about the automobile, or at least believed, taking the notion of automobile utopia quite literally, believed in the perfectibility of the territories of the automobile. So I'm gonna do that by framing this with architectural and urban discourse, beginning, of course, with Disneyland. We're looking here at the Autotopia ride, which was in the Anaheim park, the Anaheim theme park, from the day that it opened until the present. It was indeed predicated as an automobile utopia. From the very beginning, people noticed the irony of sort of driving for an hour out of Los Angeles to get to Anaheim, only to wait in a line to get back into a little car that you would drive around the track. Irony aside, what's important for us in terms of discourse is that this idea of an automobile utopia, the Disney Imagineers did not coin the term, but they certainly popularized it. So it existed kind of in the popular discourse as a place that was dominated by cars and the infrastructure of cars. But it was not until the late 1960s and into the early 1970s that the term autotopia as an automobile utopia was very specifically introduced into architectural and urban discourse. And that happened, of course, through the work of Reyner Banham, beginning with his television program, Reyner Banham Loves Los Angeles, and then, of course, with the publication of his book, Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies. For Banham, autotopia is one of his four critical ecologies. And if we think of an ecology as something that transcends the physical and begins to get into the social and cultural, we understand the significance of the relationship between cars and buildings as it had emerged over the course of the 20th century. I think one of the things that is, what happened? Sorry, my slides are out of order. One of the things that is significant about Banham's engagement with Autotopia is that he was interested in something slightly more subtle than simply the way that the car had produced very specific building typologies. He was absolutely interested in gas stations, in drive-in movie theaters, in drive-in restaurants, but he was also interested in the subtle ways in which other, let's call them more traditional forms of architecture, had begun to respond to the realities of the car. And I think that's something that is perhaps too often misunderstood about Banham and his work and the way in which he's engaging with the sites of the automobile. And one way of thinking about that is that even beyond the Los Angeles Architecture of Four Ecologies, he continued to engage with the relationship between architecture and the automobile in other critical writings. So, for example, he makes an argument that the TWA terminal, which we generally don't think about in relationship to its automobile, because we think about it in the context of the jet age and its relationship to the expanding infrastructure of airplanes. For Banham, the entire design of Saarinen's now kind of iconic terminal, now of course a boutique hotel and restaurant complex, for Banham, the point was how you approached this from the car, not from the train, but from the car. And so if we go back to those original Ezra Stoller photographs, such as the one that you see on the top and then the black and white in the center, what you're looking at is something that can be understood in formal terms in relationship to the perspective of the driver and the approach of the terminal. That notion of the relationship between the driver's point of view and the built fabric, whether that is the individual building or the city as a whole, is absolutely critical to the discourse of what I call autotopia. If Banham sets the stage for us, it is of course the work of Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, and Stephen Eisenhower, most famously in the publication of 1972, Learning from Las Vegas, that I think the relationship between the driver's point of view and built form really gets solidified with respect to architectural discourse. As I'm sure everyone gathered with us today knows, this is a book that was an investigation, as they described it, of architecture as space and architecture in space. But I think it's important to note that, again, in terms of the way in which Learning from Las Vegas has become so overwhelming in architectural and urban discourse, that it's important to remember that for Venturi and Scott Brown, this was a study of method rather than content. What happened, of course, is that the content of Las Vegas, which for them was simply the most extreme example of a kind of autopian form, that overwhelmed their larger conversation about the relationship between car, movement, static form, and the city. So we have to kind of go back to those original analyses and think about the kinds of formal analyses they were doing, particularly with relation to space, speed, and symbol, to the relationship, of course, famously of the car to the building. I should also note, just to put in this context, because this will come back, Venturi and Scott Brown were very much influenced by Ed Ruscha and the work that he had done of every building on the Sunset Strip. These are their Ed Ruscha investigations of the Las Vegas Strip. But again, that relationship between what emerges as the discourse of architecture in relation to the car is very much connected to the discourse of art and more broadly popular culture at the time. The most famous, perhaps, analysis that Venturi and Scott make is their duck versus decorated shed, which relates directly to, of course, the role of the car as a kind of focuser of attention. Again, Los Angeles and Las Vegas are perhaps the most important exemplars, but the very notion of the duck itself is predicated on an old roadside building that had been in Riverhead, Long Island, since the 1920s, which reminds us, and this is the larger point I want to make, that however important Banham and Venturi are, and Venturi and Scott Brown are to the creation of this discourse as we understand it, it existed almost from the moment that cars began to roll off the assembly line at Ford's Model T plant just outside of Detroit. And so I want to kind of step us back historically in order to move us back up to the present, most famously in the 30s. And the point I want to make here is that these buildings and urban schemes were absolutely discussed at the time by city planners, by architects, by the sort of more broader kind of building and city presses. So, for example, back in Los Angeles, which we think of course, as a city built on the automobile, even though its attenuation is, of course, directly connected to the extensive streetcar line that predated the automobile. There was an awareness that the automobile was going to change not only built form, but urban form as well. Most famously, we can think about the work of Miracle Mile, which begins in the 1920s and then culminates in projects like Bullock's Wilshire, which, as you'll see in the next slide, unless these are all, there we go, in the next slide, and this is an image on the right of Ed Ruscha's 34 parking lots. One of the things that was so important about the development of Miracle Mile is that it is a place in which we begin to see significant architectural form directly responding to the realities of the car. In other words, what happens to the building? What happens to architecture when it needs to respond to the realities of a moving vehicle? Does it maintain the street line, or does it begin to pull back in order to accommodate famously the fields of parking that we see here? In the case of Bullock's Wilshire, as well as May and Company, they still maintain that much older, we could even call it Main Street line. But gradually, as we move into the middle of the century, that street wall of built form is going to give way, and we're going to see a kind of complete transformation of the way that the the building hits the ground with respect to the territories of the car. On the opposite coast, architects are beginning to grapple with the same thing in the 1920s and the 1930s. Famously, we have Stein, Wright, and Cautley creating the town for the motor age of Radburn. This is within the metropolitan area of New York City in Bergen County. They too, their simple question is, what happens to traditional form? In this case, the house and the residential neighborhood. What happens to that form when we begin to deal with the car? They offer one solution that sort of creates a layered system of both motorway and footway. We see it more significantly, this kind of response, in the commercial environment, which of course was an important subject eventually for Banham and for Venturi and Scott Brown. Again, roughly at the same time that the Miracle Mile is being developed in Los Angeles on the East Coast, we have Arthur B. Heaton's project for the real estate developer Shannon and Lux. This is the Park and Shop on Connecticut Avenue. In some ways, it would appear, and it still stands in the 21st century, this is still a bustling commercial corridor, it would appear completely insignificant. This is what Banham would have eventually called one of the accepted monuments of Autotopia. It was, by many accounts, and this was written about continuously in the American architecture press at the time, the way in which this project pulled itself back from the major sort of arterial boulevard of Connecticut Avenue in order to accommodate parking for the cars, and also to provide this very sort of thin, if you will, transitional space for pedestrians themselves as they get out of the car, enter into the sheltered canopy, and then penetrate into the building itself. So a kind of these initial responses in the 1930s that are happening as architects are grappling with what it means to design for and with the automobile. We tend to think about kind of iconic projects, many of them unrealized, such as those of Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, which utilized one of his earliest projects to engage with the automobile, the so-called automobile objective, this monumental form of a ziggurat that was meant to be built at Sugarloaf in Maryland. Never realized, of course, it will eventually influence the design of the Guggenheim on Fifth Avenue itself. But what's interesting here is that Wright, who was himself an automobile obsessive, even though he never learned to drive, in some ways, this is very much like a conventional kind of viewing pavilion, except it's one that begins to take into account movement in space. So it's called the automobile objective. The objective was meant to kind of look out at the landscape, but the car is really always the focal point here. What we tend to forget is the way in which the automobile was also built into the fabric of Wright's Broadacre City. We can think of the automobile objective as it reappears in Broadacre City as a kind of the beginnings of a monumentality, almost a conventional monumentality for the auto age. But Broadacre City itself is actually fascinated by the infrastructure of the automobile as well. Wright described the details of Broadacre City, of these great highway exchanges, which of course he did not invent. They had already been much commented upon when the first grade separated cloverleaf opens in Middlesex, New Jersey, near Woodbridge, again on the outskirts of the metropolitan landscape of New York in 1929. That grade separation is really critical. For Wright, it becomes an opportunity for architectural investigation. And in fact, he describes in the original publication of Broadacre, he describes the great highway architecture. So again, thinking about the opportunities for the architecture to, let's say, insinuate himself or herself within the new landscapes that are going to be designed. Wright, of course, continues to sort of obsessively update Broadacre into the 1950s. It gets kind of goofier and more Jetson-like with each iteration. And eventually, when he publishes it again as The Living City in 1958, he's also including his own car design. So again, that relationship between architects and the actual design of the vehicles themselves, I think, is significant. By the 1950s, in the United States and in much of North America, the car had utterly transformed the built environment. Nonetheless, architects continued to grapple with this idea of perfectibility. And I think in terms of those who truly made a profound contribution to taking the car seriously as, forgive the pun, a driver of architectural and urban ideas, we need to kind of give first rank to Victor Gruen. At this point in the 1940s, he's partnered with Elsie Krumek, who was actually his wife at the time, and they begin a kind of architectural practice that is also extremely analytical. As Gruen and Krumek are working on this project, and then into their work, into Gruen's own work in the 1950s, he's interested in what he calls the analysis of the automobile and architecture. And he's looking at the ways in which architecture itself and kind of conventional form should change to accommodate the car. In this case, it's a freestanding department store outside of downtown Los Angeles, where Miller-Ron's had its kind of flagship store. And what Gruen and Krumek do is not simply to kind of like build a department store, a big box, if you will, simply in the middle of a field of parking. They actually begin to think through every convention of a department store, the shop windows, the sort of secondary retail uses. They begin to think of all of these in terms of how the car can fit into and serve existing functions. And so he thinks about not simply the relationship of surface parking, but also of utilizing the roof as another kind of occupiable space. In this case, the images that you see down here in the sort of lower center, that is actually the roofscape of the department store that itself is functioning as a kind of almost a sort of a kind of secondary strip of stores. The Julius Shulman photograph of the great crossed ramps shows us the kind of formal drama that Gruen is interested in. This is also a photograph that was reproduced in Banham's Los Angeles book. Gruen continues this investigation, of course, famously in his shopping centers, both the Southfield Center in Michigan, and then in the Northdale Center, the Northfield in Detroit, and then the Southdale Center in Edina, the first fully enclosed shopping mall. For Gruen, these are as much investigations in the formal possibilities of architectural modernism as they are a rethinking of the relationship of the car to traditional forms. So in each case, it's never simply the design of a single one-off project. For Gruen, this is about rethinking what the modern city is. He does a very sophisticated urban analysis of the scattered city. He's looking ahead and from the middle of vantage point of the 1950s and saying there's going to be chaos by 1976. How do we deal with it? What should a new city form look like? And for Gruen, it is not simply about designing one-off buildings that happen to accommodate the car. He makes an argument that we need to rethink our social and urban forms. And what we're looking at here, especially on the sort of the lower level, it's him thinking through a series of growing units from the neighborhood up to a kind of single urban unit to what he describes as the sort of cluster city. So he's thinking through the implications of the car, but always importantly, and this is an image that comes out of his office at the same time, the perspective of the driver. What Gruen does that then Banham and Venturi and Scott Brown pick up is to make an argument that the driver is as authentic an urban figure as the walker. And I think we need to underline that, this kind of privileging, if you will, and prioritizing of the role of the driver. Gruen is not alone in this respect. a number of other architectural designers and urban thinkers are also working on this at the time. J.B. Jackson would be the most significant outside of architectural practice. Inside architectural and urban practice, Christopher Tunard and Boris Pushkarev's Man-Made America is a whole series of investigations of precisely this subject, looking at both the design of highways as well as the design of buildings on highways. These are analyses from on the left from that book, in which they're actually attempting to sort of analyze what we see through the windshield and how we respond to that. Again, they're not alone at the time. Many, many other design thinkers are also working on this. What's important, I think, about Tunard and Pushkarev is that their analysis actually attempts to relate mid-20th century built form to what we might describe as kind of traditions of monumentality. And they make an argument, in fact, that we shouldn't think that there is something so different about, say, a rest stop on a highway, and this happens to be one in Oklahoma, that again still stands, a building that actually stretches out across an interstate that had been completed in the early 60s. They make an argument that this is no different from the way, you know, a traveler in the Middle Ages or afterwards would in fact have perceived a Gothic cathedral like Chartres from the distance. So they argue that somehow architects have been so distracted by the newness of the automobile that they forget, in fact, that the modes of perception that are at work in terms of the near distance and far distance should, in fact, be brought into the discussions of design for and with the car. Again, they are not alone. This takes us to a moment, I would argue, in the 50s and in the 60s, when architects really start to say, well, what does it mean? We can continue to remake our commercial districts. We can think about the way the car needs to be integrated into our residential districts. But what about this idea of the city as a whole? Because this is a moment, as we all know, it's a moment that is traditionally described as a period of urban decline in central cities. And yet many precisely because of the automobile, as well as kind of larger issues of socioeconomic inequality. But architects begin to say, maybe what we need to do is to not simply like rebuild our cities with highways. Maybe what we need to begin to do is to think about a kind of a new form of urban monumentality that takes the car into account. Lou Kahn did that throughout the 1950s in a series of projects for Philadelphia, in which he thinks about the relationship of center city Philadelphia and the car. And he imagines this idea of a series of parking docks forming, and he's not alone, Gruen is doing this in Fort Worth as well, thinking about this idea of these docks, if you will, that could be monumental urban forms. They could be the kind of a mid and late 20th century equivalent of, say, the ancient gates to older cities. So Kahn begins to do this in a kind of conceptual work. I will end with one final project. That I think in some ways is the perfect celebration of these ideas. This is Paul Rudolph's Temple Street Garage in New Haven, completed in 1963 in one of his kind of tremendous renderings. It is a parking garage that decks the city, that allows the fabric of the city to move through it. It is a parking garage that also included commercial space in it. So he was thinking about the idea of the architecture of stopping. That was a term that Kahn used that I think Rudolph very much follows up on. What does it mean to use a kind of monumental, even heroic reinforced concrete form as a way of creating a new kind of urban monument in the context of the 20th century city? For Rudolph, it was never about a building that simply sort of was plopped down into the urban fabric. He was actually thinking about it in relationship to the existing and transforming layout of both historic New Haven, and you can see some Greek revival buildings in the background there, to its relationship to the modern city. This is, of course, a moment when the new interstates are being both plowed through and around the city. And I will leave you with one final image, that unfortunately is my quote there from Rudolph is cut off. What he's saying there is, we should find a way of seeing our buildings above our automobiles. Throughout the 50s and into the 60s, Paul Rudolph, perhaps surprisingly, began to think about the relationship of the car to built form, and offered, I think, certainly in the example of the Temple Street Garage and in his famous, sometimes infamous project for the Lower Manhattan Expressway called Lomex, offered, I think, really sort of poignant and sophisticated ways in which architects needed to, at multiple levels, deal with and engage with the relationship between the car, the city, and contemporary urban form. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle, for a very nice kickoff. First, I would like to open up for questions to our students, to the audience, and maybe to, if there's some questions from colleagues also. We have about 10 minutes until we go to the next lecture. Would somebody like to start?
Sure, I have a question. Thank you, Gabrielle, for your interesting lecture. It's always nice to see. I particularly like to see these photographs of Ed Ruscha every now and then. So thank you for that. Thank you also for showing this reference by Tannard and Pushkarev, these diagrams depicting how much a driver actually sees. I was wondering if, I have two questions about this. Do you know if there's any examples of architects really using this, applying this in the way they design building? I mean, if you don't see a building so much, maybe it's less important to make stuff visible. So that's something I was wondering. And I was wondering another thing. This publication was from the 60s. So I'm wondering now, maybe 50 years later, well, cars have evolved or have changed a lot, but the speed of driving and I guess our human physiology hasn't changed that much. Would this publication still be relevant, or do you think anything needs to be reviewed in these statistics as to make it, I don't know, applicable today? So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you. Those are both bringing up really interesting issues. There are isolated examples of architects attempting to actually take this kind of perspective into account. But I don't think I can give you any that show the sort of like, well, this field of vision translates into how I understand this. I think it's much more, the examples are all much more perceptual. And I think we could argue that in Venturi and Scott Brown's early work, in a general sense, if we think about the showrooms, like the Basco showroom and the series that of buildings that they did in the kind of late 70s in the Philadelphia suburbs, those were certainly an attempt to take their analysis of speed and scale, which in some ways is simply a more intuitive version of what Tannard and Pushkarev are doing. I think those are examples, and perhaps the best examples, and the lowest hanging, as it were, because they're well documented. The best examples of that. I think also Gruen, throughout the entirety of his office, while he's still working very much in the field of shopping mall and shopping center design, again, someone who, if you kind of dive into the publications that he produced at the time, both the kind of articles that were in things like Architectural Forum and Architectural Record, but also in his books about shopping, that's again where you can attempt to find that the closest connection or the closest parallel between, let's say, the sort of data-driven analysis and actual architectural design. Importantly, because Gruen, of course, is hit in some ways, he would never have used the term data-driven, but I think his practice, because of the way he was offering a set of services to developers that were about anticipating where a population is going to go precisely because of highway construction, et cetera. The second part of your question, so interesting, because in terms of much of the work of the 60s, that was being done in terms of thinking about the relationship of the car, the driver, the highway, and the city, there was an acceptance, if you will, that of kind of urban highways that were being driven through the center of dense existing fabrics. And even as people began to kind of question that, and of course there's the famous freeway revolts in San Francisco, for the most part, we find designers just kind of accepting the status quo of an urban highway that is being driven through a dense urban fabric. And while there's some who are attempting to sort of signal a way of rethinking that, for the most part, that's the status quo. So that's what architects are responding to. Now, of course, in terms of how we would have to rethink that, across North America, at least, we've got those highways being taken down, right? And attempts to kind of heal the rift that was caused. I would argue that we're never going to be able to take all of those highways down. And so that one of the ways that one could rethink this is by going back to the original analysis and actually attempting to design more thoughtfully. I mean, I think the thing about books like Man-Made America and others, The View from the Road, which was a Kevin Lynch, Donald Appleyard book, one of the things that they did was to offer the opportunity for designing with the car and the highway. But for the most part, that literally gets again, excuse the pun, left by the side of the road. Because of the other sort of realities that are happening at the time, in which, like, okay, you're just designing the building. You're not actually designing the entirety of the space. You know, we can even think about what's happening in Japan in the 60s, right? And the metabolists thinking about architecture and urbanism requiring a new equation, architecture as urbanism. And I think there are these parallels. For us now, we need to go back to that. If we're truly in an era of where the autonomous vehicle is about to change everything, this in fact might be the moment to actually say, well, what am I seeing as I cruise down the road in my autonomous vehicle?
And maybe also while we're teaching our self-driving vehicles to see, right? Then what are they supposed to perceive? Great.
Absolutely.
Cool, thanks.
Somebody else had a question?
I have a question. Thank you for your sharing. I come from a city that car is a part of a bigger part of our life. Also, I come from Jakarta, so someday we spend more time in car than our own house. But do you think this automobile give the importance of the interiority of this car and the building? Because in Jakarta, you don't really there is no importance on this. Because of cars, you need to go to one place to the other place, and you always want to go inside the place. Then this space that in between cars and this building is not very attractive anymore, and it's not really pleasing when you go out your car and go into this building. But do you have any idea how to make this more attractive? Because if you come to Jakarta, our urban fabric space is not very attractive, and that's what happened when we, Yeah,
I think it has to do with, I think you're one, absolutely correct. Two, it's related to the, let's say, the intense proliferation of automobiles, beginning, early 20th century in some places, and then, later 20th century in other places. And one could argue that the cars outstripped the ability of, whether it's architects or builders, to actually think through those liminal spaces. And yet, again, if we go back to this moment in the 60s, when there was still a belief in the possibility of improvement, you have people like J.B. Jackson, Gruen, Banham, Denise Scott Brown, talking quite poignantly about that idea of a liminal space. Banham wrote an essay about, kind of like a cheesy themed restaurant. But one of the things that he did was to actually describe You're on the highway, you pull into the parking lot, and then almost in a kind of scenographic way, each moment you get out of the car, you approach the entrance, you enter into the space. And he was making an argument that there needed to be a kind of orchestration of those steps, if you will, right? Those steps of movement. And too often it's simply ignored, right? We drive up, we park, we transition to the interior. I think one of the things that was of great interest at mid-century, and maybe now if it got incorporated into so many logistics discussions of last mile is always discussed in terms of how to get the crap from point A to point B, but never as really a design challenge as we might think about it aesthetically. So again, I would argue, and one of the reasons I ended up writing this book was because I felt like there had been a discussion that happened that was largely forgotten. And that I do, and again, I say this as an historian who teaches in an architecture school, I do think that history has lessons to teach us for contemporary practice. So I would say go back to that kind of mid-century discussion and see what a value still exists.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We need to move on to Benedict's talk, but I hope that there'll be another moment if somebody else has questions for Gabrielle later towards the end. It's a pleasure to welcome Benedict Redgrove, who is a London-based photographer. His projects, he's done projects for Audi A8, McLaren, Aston Martin, and Volvo. He has captured the automobile from the interior to the exterior. In today's talk, he will present his work where he is basically situated cars within architecture. So at any rate, thank you for being here with us, Benedict. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, really honored to be asked to do this. So thanks very much indeed. Yes, so as you're saying, I've been working with on cars and sort of shooting architecture. Can you see the screen, by the way? Is that working? Sure, hold on.
There we go.
Got it?
Perfect.
Yeah, so I've been, I work with various advertising agencies and design agencies on trying to make their cars or whatever vehicle it is at the time show its values. And so the first thing I ever think about whenever I'm commissioned is how can what's the location? What is it that I'm going to be able to bring to this that's going to enhance or give a bit more of a story about the car? I grew up in the sort of 70s, so with the space age and concept cars and everything that was the sort of brave new world and brave new future. So everything then looked and felt like it was going to be exciting. And I think even now you sort of compare those concept cars and the architecture from that period. And it's got a very positive look. It's got a very much a sort of, this is the future, this is the world, you know, it is sort of in some ways less practical and more sort of emotional in its outlook. And so this first story I want to show you was one that I shot for Wallpaper magazine. It was originally going to be a story, just like a couple of page story about one car. And then I got to the location and phoned the editor and just said, "You're not going to believe this place. This is everything you want. It's architecture and design and cars." And so these are all concept cars from Bertoni Design Studios. They were all designed in the 60s and 70s. And they all have this sort of period where, again, it was that sort of futurism and space and technology and anything pointy and sharp kind of meant the future. So I was fortunate enough to be shown around, and I could pick whatever car from the collection. There was a museum there, and the idea with concept cars is they're supposed to be, it's a concept. It's not something that's actually going to be driven or used on the road. It's an idea to say, look, these are features or ideas that we can then try and get into production. and this was an early one for a Lancia Stratos, which later turned into a rally car, but it was it sort of worked with their coloring and worked with the building. The Bertoni Design Studios have a few house colors that they tend to use on all their concept cars and designs, which are green, orange, and white. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to go around the entire museum, pick out various cars from various places and just put them into scenarios that I felt kind of worked with the design, and then work together. You know, the whole theory on, or the whole way I work is there needs to be a symbiosis between the car and the building. You know, one needs to reflect the other, or needs to sort of have some kind of message that enhances one item or the other. So normally in this case, it's the car needs to be shown off more by the building. But with Bertoni Design Studios, it was everything worked together because that's where it was created, and all the colors and all the architecture were obvious influences on the way they worked and the studies they had for their cars. So there's this amazing brutalist building with their incredible orange entranceway and the sort of goldy bronzy orange of the concept car as well. And then we went inside and we shot this is a Lamborghini Countach concept. This isn't a room where they use for viewing. So every car design studio has a viewing room where the car's normally on a rotating turntable. And it's there to show either the client, the commissioner of the design study, or various sort of guests. You're supposed to show off the design lines and form of the car really without getting too much interference. This is probably the quirkiest and craziest one I've ever seen. You've got so many reflections that form in the car. It's kind of counterintuitive to what it does, but I think as this particular car in that particular environment, it works very well. And for me, it's matching the form of the car or the function of the car with the building or the location that I'm trying to show. Whether that's something very simple, or in this case, it was the period. So that this part of the building was when this part of this car was designed. And so putting the two together was just a no-brainer. It's a very simple process. I think anyone would spot that. But it is that mixture of showing an emotion that you're trying to catch the designer had, that you're hoping that this was something they were thinking at the time, the kind of futurist look, matching the architecture that it was in. It's kind of nuts places. Angles, those 70s angles are incredible. And then there's another part of the museum, which was, this is the more modern area. I think it's a sort of 90s wing that they built, which is a concrete underground area, which they displayed their whole collection in. And again, for me, there's a sort of retro chic, I suppose, about this design. So the car is obviously a 60s design, but it's within actually early 90s building. So the two marry up really nicely, but I think because of the reflection in the paintwork, you get that nice sense of a period gone by, I guess, that sort of slightly romantic Las Vegas overhead glossiness. And again, the white and the concrete, you're mirroring something there that has an aspirational feel to it, but also there's a slight set of romance. And again, it's something in this particular design of the car that suggested it was a little bit more than just something hard, fast, glorious. There was something that you needed to show, which was a bit more romantic. So we had the doors up and we showed it with those long strip ceilings, which are designed to give a bit of a glossy feel to the car. And again, it's just showing the sort of quirky features, right, of this design against the simplicity of the architecture. It's more often than not, for me, it does do the surroundings of the location allow for the design of the car to stand out? Do they work together in some kind of way, or does one fight against the other? Is one too busy? In this case, you know, the lines on the wall match the horizontal lines on the car. So it's quite an easy puzzle to solve a lot of the time. And the same again for this, you know, you've got your eyes being taken down towards the center of the car. And you've got the very strong, hard, fast graphic lines of the location, and then the slightly more slightly curvaceous, but I guess still quite sharp in places. But those lines that just jump out of the background, which is, that's more often than not what we're trying to do, is show an object in a way that lets that object stand out. And then what's the emotion, or what's the relevance to the building, to the vehicle? Does it give you a sense of what it's about? In this case, you can't go wrong because it's the location they were all created, but it's also that sense that it's all design. Everything here is design. This was one of the first wedge design cars ever created, and this was in another area of their design studios that was for viewing, one of the newer areas. But the colors of the car and the colors of the location and the composition, with all the angles going off at various perspective points, and just makes for a kind of interesting dynamic. And this was used on the wallpaper cover for that issue. I think it was the most successful cover they had at the time. But it's again, you're getting that sense of depth, which only going on location can really give you. And it's only when you actually go onto a location, you can see these things in plan form, and it's not until you're actually there, often there with a camera in your hand as well. That's when images tend to show up. That's when you start to get a bit of an understanding between me and the camera and the location we're in, and I can start to form an idea about how compositions are going to work, what the dynamic is of it. And it's often just moving tiny distances, like an inch left or right, can make the difference between something really communicating with you and just otherwise looking quite flat and not very exciting. So I get to work with some sort of fairly cool locations, and sometimes with architectural heroes of mine. And this place in Spain, Asturias, was just incredible, because this car is it's called Robo Race, talking about autonomous cars earlier on. And this is it's an autonomous race car. The idea being there'll be a race series, and various banks of computers will be racing against other various banks of computers with the AI information they're given. It's really meant as a development. So the race series is kind of fun, but it's meant as a sort of development series of what really will happen. This famously drove itself straight into a brick wall, its very first test. So they got it to Silverstone Circuit and invited everyone to come and see it. And it basically went forward, turned right, and drove straight into a pit wall. So that was the most auspicious of starts. But for me, when they were asking for a location, they wanted to shoot this on location or shoot it on CGI. And I suggested that we take it to a place, because it's such a dramatic design that you need to be there. You need to have that relationship between camera, car, and photographer and location. And so we were looking at various places, and the Oscar Niemeyer Center in Asturias was just perfect to me. His work is Brave New World. It is all the future. It is the most exciting. Even now, it's still incredibly exciting. And I think for what they were trying to show in the sort of, this is the future of car design in some ways, but more car communicate technology, I felt like this was the right place to go. And so we shot for a couple of days over here, and moved around a car that you can't sit in or drive, which is quite interesting. But it's the idea of what were we trying to talk about. So for me, it was definitely the future tech side of it, and it was a sense of, there is no one here, right? There's no human interaction here, because there is no human interaction with the car. It's fully machined. There's no one. It's not remote control. It's not controlled by anything apart from a computer brain, and that's it. And so I wanted to keep people away and keep any sort of sense of control by anyone away. There's human buildings. There's obviously buildings here designed for people, because there's glass windows, and in a few of the others you'll see some references. But it is designed to be that sort of very clean, ultra high tech environment. And I think when I'm thinking about these sorts of shoots, these sorts of projects, then it's architects like him that really allow that to happen. We could have gone to other places, I guess. I guess we could have probably used someone like Santiago Calatrava's places, and they're still kind of futury, but I feel that they're so busy. There's so much going on in his designs, and in some ways they feel to me anyway, and I'm no architecture student, right? So I might be seeing some terrible things here, but to me, they can sometimes feel a little bit too contrived or a bit too much going on. Whereas I feel like Oscar's work is kind of like, it's just so simple and pure, everything's stripped back. And that's what I try to do in my work, is just include the essential ingredients and remove everything else that's not important. So you focus on whatever's in the shot, whatever's there, I want you to see. So everything else that's been removed or taken away in some form or another in post or physically when we're there, that's what's left for a reason. It makes for a simpler shot, and it makes for a stronger shot as well. Yeah, I mean, there's so many features in this place. I could have spent 2 or 3 more days shooting there. But yeah, he's got those glass walls, and the light, of course, in northwest Spain was pretty spectacular as well. One of his kind of signature buildings. Yeah, I left the lighting in there to signify that there is some human interaction, and that this building is obviously a viewing platform. So that again was kind of done so that you would get a sense of human relations with the vehicle as well. So I think it's subtle touches like that are important. If you strip all these things away, then it becomes this kind of sort of dystopian no man's land. And it's important that, especially in this case, they want to maintain that sense of humanity to a certain degree. We were mentioning McLaren earlier on as well. So one of I tend to get asked by a lot of high-tech companies to work for them because I guess the way I work is very clean and minimalist, and that tends to work with their aesthetic. So we were shooting with McLaren Tech Center when they launched the MC12, which is this car. They wanted to shoot it. They wanted an orange car in their environment, and I said, well, it's not very subtle, and it's not really going to do you a sort of load of tech favors. It's just going to look like a big orange blob in this white area. So I managed to convince them to shoot a white car in a white environment. I mean, obviously the white spectrum is made up of various colors. So you can see in here, there's kind of cyans and magentas and yellows in here. So it keeps that sense of richness and life to them. But at the same time, you have a very clean, ultra tech environment. There's a Norman Foster building, which was designed with the head of McLaren at the time. Apparently, the rumor is, I'm not entirely sure if this is true, but he wanted to see if we could get rid of all the toilets in the building because they were taking up too much space. But I think the sort of law suggests that people do need to go to the loo. So, but it's a pretty incredible environment, and everything is built on this sort of perfect grid. Even the building that is measured to match the width of the tiles that were equipped for it. So it was quite high specification. And they have these incredible areas that are just, again, it's that sort of futurist, modernist take on technology. And my challenge is always to try and make sure that the two are harmonized together, and that you're not looking at one more than the other, and the one is bringing out the qualities of the vehicles in these cases. So they're amazing environments to work in. They're quite draining at times because they can be sterile to a certain point, even the air quality sometimes, but it's more just sometimes you have this false light, or you have the sound, or the air quality can be a little draining, which I find is an interesting point in environments which are supposed to be made for this kind of pure technology. And Ferrari, interestingly, had an issue with that when they built their new factory, and they built a new engine plant. And to get around this, they brought in different types of lighting, and they put plants everywhere, thinking it would really help. And in fact, what happened after a while was the plants were covered in this kind of dust from the machines and from human interaction, I guess. And they didn't seem to commission anyone to go in and look after the plants. So the plants ended up looking like plastic plants, and so it felt even more false than it was before. So I think there's a lot to be said for these incredible environments that look amazing, but possibly lack a touch that would help be a little bit more creative in the spaces. But I guess in this spaces they just want the clean tech, right? Yeah, so they also have, this is another viewing area similar to the one that I was showing before, but obviously a lot more modern, with a carbon fiber rotation turntable and mirrored ceiling. And so this is their new, or the last time I was there shooting their sort of newer sports car. And again, it's that sense of what do you want? You know, McLaren are a highly regarded technology company, automotive technology company, and they really want to show that off, and they want to feel like they are the leaders in this area, and that this is what you're seeing is where we work. This is how we work. This is how we operate. There is no room for error. Everything is perfect. And so we tried to sort of show that in all the imagery, which is, you know, just give it that edge of perfection and almost a sort of slight unrealness to it as well. But it's yeah, they're incredible places to work. And I guess when you're trying to show this to a public, sometimes they don't realize that it's real. They feel like it's not being CGI'd. And I do work a lot with CGI as well, in certain technologies when we can't shoot on location, or if there's a rule where there's a certain element that we can't show, then we will do that. But in this case, these were all real, just a little bit of cleanup in it, and you get the idea of this slightly ethereal, perfect world, which works, I guess, for the people that want to buy those cars. They're fairly wealthy, and they everything is set to a standard, it seems to be. Another architectural favorite of mine is Zaha Hadid's office, and they did the DDP building in South Korea. And so I worked with Polestar on their new car. And again, this talking about CGI, we went out there to shoot the locations, and because it's a public plaza and there's lots of different levels, we couldn't really get the car into some of the areas. So what we would do is we'd go and shoot locations, and while we were shooting them, we would then take a cube and you would put that in the position of where the car would be, and then we take some light, 360-degree light readings for reflections. And then while we're on location, because we've got a CGI model of the car, we can drop that into the location and see if it's working from a perspective point of view. Obviously, those aren't the famous mountains of Seoul, but that's normally where the mountains are. Is normally some office blocks behind, but we took those out because this is the whole idea of this car is it's supposed to be driving into this futuristic world. And as far as sort of futuristic architecture goes, it's quite hard to beat that location. It's got a lot going for it. And so we spent this 2 days photographing in these sort of various spots around the top and the lower levels. And it's once you're there, I think that architecture completely guided the shoot. It's one of those ones where we had a rough idea of what we wanted to do, certain angles on the car, but most car advertising and car photography tends to be very bold. It's a car in the foreground, or it's a car at 3/4 front, and then you shoot. And I wanted this to be the other way around. I wanted the architecture to tell the story, and the car was just this little part of it. You know, you can make up your own narrative as you go along. So this one was more like, I kind of felt like it was dropping off someone or picking someone up from a station or a certain part. And so really we're totally guided by the architecture there, which was, it's a joyous way of working, actually, as someone that is a big fan of these kind of buildings and locations. And it's just a nice chance to feel free. And again, you can play it once you've got a car that's a CGI model, you can just play around with the scale. So that's not the scale of the location at all. But it's by enlarging the car up a little bit more, you can suddenly make things feel smaller or bigger or more grand or a little bit more intimate. And we were, we played around with lots of different things. So the ground you see in the shot is actually a false ground that we put in afterwards, because the ground they had there had sort of lots of ribs in, which got a bit distracting. Some of the concrete's been cleaned slightly. There was, I'm not sure how the process works when they're making those mixes, but there's obviously a very fine mix which is on the outside, and it's I guess it's set in different layers, and they probably had issues with some aggregates that were going in at certain times, or drying times, or maybe the weather was a bit off on certain periods. So there's all these sort of different lines through the concrete in various places, which was interesting to work with. Actually, it's a really nice way of seeing something that's supposed to have this pure form, but actually has a little bit of human in it. There's a little bit of you know, someone's work schedule in there, in their work day, or it's quite interesting to see that the history of something that's been made relatively recently. Again, the location offers lots of sort of different views, really, and opportunities to sort of shoot down, up and around. And you know, there's angles that suggest this future that was supposed to be a clean environment. That Polestar are a Swedish car brand owned by a Chinese company, and they this is a purely electric car, so there's no engine in here at all. So I think this is one of the reasons why we were allowed to use the building as well, because it was obviously a license that you have to buy to show that building. And I guess they don't really want to show it if it's a combustion engine, but now the electric, we can happily do that. Again, this was shot from a building across the street. I was like 25, 30 stories up, leaning over a building. I don't really like heights, so this is quite a dramatic picture. But yeah, it's that, again, the sense of what story do you get from what's the building telling you here, and what's the narrative of the image, and you just get a sense that there's something, you know, they've either dropped someone off, or someone's run in, or it's stopped here to pick someone up. It's the little bit of slight mysticism, but again, you're focused solely on that. And Zaha's architecture, I think, has so much complexity in some of the forms and some of the textures, but the actual image itself is quite simple in some ways. And you have you know, the way the composition works is it sort of takes you down to that point, and that's your focus area. This was in their display area. So they had this quite incredible white auditorium, which was just, I don't know, these places make me feel incredibly excited. I think I love that idea that architecture has an incredible effect on you. You know, I mean, if you're working in a building that's great, then obviously that's going to lift your mood. And if you see one on your journey to work, then it can lift your mood. And I think cars have a similar effect on people. You know, if you pick a car because it says something about you, or you think it says something about you, and you feel that other people recognize that in your choice. And I guess it's the nearest thing we get. You can't take your house with you, and you can't take your apartment with you. So the nearest thing you really get are your clothes to give you some kind of definition of who you are, or your car. And you know, that's a sort of mobile billboard of your perceived, or the character that you want to show to people. And I felt like getting inside this building was just so exciting. And they wanted to try and have an idea that once you get inside the Polestar, there's another layer to peel off once you open the door and you get inside, and there's a level of technology and excitement inside there as well. And then I'm a fan of utilitarianism. I'm a massive fan of utilitarian design and functionality. And to me, the back stages of a building, going behind the scenes and seeing where the operations are and seeing engineering is a wonderful luxury that I get to see when I'm going to NASA or Airbus or wherever, working with the technology centers there. You get to see behind the scenes. And again, this is a goods area, but you know, it has that feeling of what is behind the door, what's going on. Is it coming in? Is it going out? Where is it leading to? Is that going to be an elevator? There's so many sort of exciting areas that these buildings allow you to sort of create this work. And then there's the craziness of those constructions that once you're underneath it, it sort of gives you more opportunities to create more stories. It was, yeah, it's an amazing location. If you ever get the chance to go, definitely go. It's absolutely a wonderful place. this was one of the final ones of the day, which was yeah, smoggy place, but quite good. But you know, again, it's the lines. I think it's when we're trying to sort of create these images, there's a lot of little tricks you can use, which buildings and locations like this really allow you to play up on the sort of dynamics of a line intersecting a much softer form behind with a shinier reflective form in front. You know, you've just got this multiple layers to build up on, and playing around with that is quite a joy, especially when you haven't actually got anything there to play around with. So, you know, bear in mind we're shooting the location, and that car's not actually there. That at the moment is just an empty box that we're using for reflections and position. So it's quite a process, but it's a nice way of working. Yeah. So the reverse of that is when we have a real car but no location. And I worked with Aston Martin a fair amount and worked on their new hypercar. And we'd shot one iteration of it before, and they wanted to shoot a new iteration which had a new paint scheme. So we shot the car in the same location as the first one, but because I didn't really want to use the same location as the last, I felt like I could make something that was a little bit more exciting and reflected a little bit more of the time that this is created, and maybe the harder forms on the outside would reflect some of the slightly curvier forms of the car. So I I loosely drew up a parametric structure, and then had my CGI team make it properly. That was quite a smooth process, actually. We spent a day just shooting the car in the studio, and then spent a few days moving the designs around until we knew when the angles we'd shot at how the tunnel structure would work on the form. So it's a question of making it simple enough that it doesn't detract from the car's form, but interesting enough that it suggests something about the technology in the car as well. So we built it as a tunnel, so it felt like there was a light at both ends, so that whenever you were looking down, there was a sense of optimism and cleanliness. And then during the inside, you felt like it was just a cool place where this was being transported from one place to another. Yeah, it's a lot of fun actually creating those environments. It fulfills another part of my mind when I get to shoot it and design the building, the location. Then that's quite a fun spot to do. So really, I mean, I think the point of the technology and design aspects of it are that you can use all these things, and this is all available to anyone. But I think it like any design, like any car design or any building or photography in general, unless you have a strong idea or a strong sense of what you're trying to create and the ability to do that, it all becomes a little bit empty. So I would say that, you know, that solid ideas well developed are great, and the technology to do it's great, but you do need the ability to create it and use them effectively. And I think that is me done.
Thank you very much, Benedict, for sharing your work with us. Maybe you can stop screen sharing so we can see everybody. So you can see everybody, and then we have some time for questions. Would somebody like to kick off?
I can. Yeah. Thank you, Benedict, for a beautiful collection of images. I think I not particularly have a question, more like a few observations, so feel free to react or not to any of them. I think there's a beautiful irony in shooting a moving object still. So I think in that sense, there's a very interesting process, especially from the photographer side of view, in which you have a tripod, you have a camera, it's like a fixed sort of placement. And it seems like you first select the frame, and then you find a way to sort of like smuggle the car inside the frame. I'm particularly fond of the images in which we only see half of the car, because it suggests it suggests an environment, a room, an entry, an accessway, and more of a natural way of approaching a car, as if it were just parked outside the door. There you can just see a fragment, the backside. So I think there's a beautiful composition in that, just looking at a little bit of the car. And I think there's also an interesting pair of images in which the white Lamborghini for Bertone, in which it's the same, let's say, composition of the image with the lights on the ceiling, but the car is the one that is moved. So it seems like the camera was just fixed and you shoot the car from the front and from the side. So I don't know, there's interesting processes as a photographer, I guess, for you to kind of find the frame, find the architecture that fits, and then the car comes again. So, and also the fact that it seems like 95% of photos of cars you see are driverless as well. So the architecture compensates the lack of a human scale inside of the car. So that's just it. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'd say my work tends to be it's sort of quite calm and quite peaceful, right? I allow everything to sort of have this sense of that you are there and there's no rush, there's no distraction. You know, everything's sort of stripped out. So you're right in that I will definitely find a composition first of the location is that's the sort of lead element for me. That's one of the first factors I think about when I'm shooting, and then we try and put the car in it. And if I like the composition, then I will use a sort of very graphic, you know, like the plan form an architect would make with a building. I use the sort of plan form of a car. More often than not, I'll try and do a flat overhead and a side profile and a front and rear profile, just because my background is graphic design as well. So I think it works very much in that realm, you know, which I sort of share a relationship between the space that's not being used and the vehicle itself and often the building. And often there'll be crops, as you say, which are just a back or a front or a 3/4, where you're only seeing a very small amount of the car, much more location. But that gives you that sense of there's a bit more interest, and it makes you start to think about the rest of the design as well.
Can I ask something? And one thing I was wondering if you notice in your work, especially when you were the commission for the Polestar 2, that I mean, it's obviously kind of the electric car. It's something that happens under the hood, and maybe the aesthetics of the carrosserie have not been necessarily affected. But in a way, it's no longer a car like we knew. It's a completely different device. And I was wondering to what extent it sort of starts to seep in the problem of the representation of this object, because we don't associate. I mean, maybe if you see a car, even if you don't smell it, you still associate it with the full sensory aspects of it. I mean, even when you don't own it or you don't drive it, it's more than just the lines. And with the, I mean, I'm always sort of surprised when you see the Polestar 2 in a showroom, like behind the glass. You know that it's an electric car, and you sort of have this sort of strange, you know, something doesn't quite fit in your mind, because, you know, it's a different thing. And I was wondering if you feel the need, I don't know, to kind of have that affect the way you relate to this object.
Yeah, I think to me, there's been very few electric car designs which have really really used the opportunity here of there's no engine at the front, right? There's nothing there. And car design to me seems to have gone, we've got electric cars, but we're still designing a car. And you have an opportunity here to do something completely different. I think the nearest mass market car that's come around that's vaguely looked something slightly different was the i3 BMW, which used a lot of recycled materials, had a very, very short front, very, very short car, but made use of that interior space quite well. I guess the new ones that there's a company called Canoe have sort of re-looked at that, but they've gone about it in a slightly funny way. They've got a bigger vehicle which looks a bit more like it should have lots of space, but is actually only a two-seater. So there are lots of designs which are slowly moving into making use or more a clever use of the ability that the engines are on the wheels and the battery compartments in the center. So I think in that respect, design is moving forward to a certain degree that's probably away from the main market manufacturers. The smaller individual designers are coming through, which is great. It's really exciting. It means people are thinking a bit more freely. As showing it in a new way, that is a very conventional car, and conventional in its look. I think the Polestar is quite conventional in its look. And so when we were shooting in this location, I was relying on the architecture to elevate it a little bit more. And these are obviously not roads. Everything it's on is not a road, right? It's a sort of cross between a pedestrian area and a road, and it sort of has a slightly more open-minded feel. And Polestar, like you say, in their showrooms, the way they're selling it is more of an object. It's a transport device, but they're selling it more as you are buying into a piece of Swedish design, and it's wonderful, and isn't it clean, and the pure lines and all of those things. But really, I think they are definitely heavily brand oriented, in what they're trying to do, and so that to me is I'm trying to elevate their brand and use this architecture hand in hand to sort of show it. But you're right, it's a conventional form.
Thank you. Just another small question. So after Bertone went bankrupt, what happened? I mean, the location still exists, or?
Yeah, unfortunately, that was really sad actually, because they were a great design studio. They went bankrupt, and all the concept cars were sold off. And there's a collector in America who actually bought the first one you saw, the Lancia Stratos. He's bought that, and he's actually got it running. He's had a new engine created for it, and he uses it. He drives it in New York. So Gabrielle, you should be able to see it somewhere. You might have even seen it, I guess. I don't know.
And the complex, let's say the buildings.
I don't know. I mean, that to me, that was one of the scary things actually. I was just hoping it wasn't going to be bulldozed down, because historically it's really interesting. You have from the birth of the company to the end of the company in architecture form. It's bloody amazing. You have all these wonderful things of when Signor Bertone started the company. You have the factory and their design studios, and then his design studios from the 60s, which were his office is as is. It had all the incredible original lamps and tables. It was all this reddy orange with reddy orange glass. It was, I don't know. I mean, those things to me should be, a site of national interest. It's incredible, right up to the sort of current museum, that concrete museum. I don't know. I sincerely hope it hasn't been knocked down, and should be, should be kept.
Or at least you documented it somehow.
Well, this is another sad thing about that story. So the lab that had my images went bankrupt, and they threw the entire shoot in the skip. So the images you see are all I've got left from that shoot. Yeah, I've spent years in therapy getting over that one. Yeah.
Sorry to bring it up.
Don't worry. But yeah, it was, I'm still desperately trying to hope that somewhere in storage I've got some contact sheets or something that I can scan. But really, it was an amazing place, and I'm very lucky to have seen it all.
Is there one final question before we move on, or remark? Case, do you have something to say? Yeah, great.
Maybe just a very hi, Benedict. Thank you for the fantastic lecture.
Thank you.
I love the photos, by the way. But you said, the car could be seen as a sort of mobile billboard of what you want to show of yourself, what defines you. So maybe do you like cars? Because obviously you like architecture, but it wasn't really clear to me whether or not you like cars and whether there would be a car that defines you.
Well, it's a very good question, isn't it? That's a good, nicely done. I have a sort of funny love affair with cars. I went through a phase of absolutely being just, it was my life basically. And I tried to go racing and I've tried various bits and I thought about car design. Yes, I think I'm a big fan of cars. I love them in all their forms. As I said before, I'm a sort of really big fan of utilitarian design. So Land Rover Defender, probably, functional.
A white one or a green one?
Well, I used to have a black one. I used to have a black Defender, and it was great. It wasn't particularly brilliant. It wasn't particularly comfortable, but it got you everywhere, and I could get all of my kit in there, and it was slightly indestructible. And I think that's probably it's a fun car. Also, fan of a Porsche. Don't get me wrong, that's great fun. But I really love electric cars as well. I've driven a few, and the way they work, if they can just get the infrastructure to be something decent, then I think it's probably going to be a mix of that and hydrogen power, and we'll be away. But they are incredibly exciting and slightly addictive with their little sounds.
Yeah, definitely.
What about you? You can't ask me that question without answering yourself.
Well, I'm also off and on very intrigued by cars and interested in it, and so definitely.
We all know what you have in the parking lot. Yes, we know what you have in the parking lot.
Yeah. I have a Porsche in the parking lot, of course, but the first time I was sitting in the back of a Tesla S. I felt that the seat was lower than in normal cars, and then I figured out that's because of the battery. So they the floor is thicker. So, and if you don't want to heighten the roof, you have to lift your knees. You're sitting like this.
Yeah.
And then the Tesla X model is a bit higher, but they still stick to this traditional shape, but sort of Xerox it a little bit to 108% or something like that.
Yes.
And that struggle, it's a bit difficult to swallow, I think. It's very difficult to look at that.
I'm really glad you said that. The Tesla X, to me, that is a failure of the. I've never heard that expression before, but the Xerox of design. It's scaling up and then not looking at individual items that go with it. Right? It's just make it like a big training shoe. It suddenly becomes a ski. And I think the Tesla X is a prime example of something turning into a not very attractive ball of a car. Yeah. Anyway, I'm not going to go down that route. That's
no,
it's not fair to
we're all looking out for really nice new designs. That are really based on new requirements and output specifications that are fitting the electric or any new technology, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for your question. Really lovely to meet you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Benedict. It's a pleasure to, have Christian Sumi here, who is Professor Emeritus at the Architecture Academy in Mendrisio. He is the author of The Goddess, La Déesse, and the editor of its predecessor, which was initiated or originally published here in Delft, the reissued edition of AS in DS. We're very keen to learn more about Christian's research and his personal interest, especially as an architect, into the Citroën DS and its potential references for architecture discourse. And thank you for being with us, CS, to talk about DS. So the screen is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it okay? Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm an architect and I'm not a special fan of cars. As you will see, my way to this car is a kind of it's a special way. It's not how to say it. There were reasons why I had then to deal with this car. I have 2 or 3 remarks before starting. So I will talk about this famous Citroën DS. These are 2 versions. This is the blue one is from 1955, the first version. And then it was a kind of a rework of the front in 1967. Sorry. This is the designer Flaminio Bertoni from Varese. And maybe this is the first remark to make. For Citroën and for the French, it was a little bit a problem, you know, in the sense that the key car or key element of French culture was designed by an Italian. And Flaminio Bertoni did design 3 other cars, the famous Traction Avant from 1935, you know, this kind of gangster car. Then the famous Deux Chevaux, and then Army 6 and the DS. So the Italian designed actually the 4 most important cars for Citroën. But we can say that somehow the design is probably Italian rooted, but the whole technique, the engineering, this is typical French. So Henri Lefebvre and so on, because they were engineers who came from aviation firms, and actually they made it possible to develop this car. So it's a kind of early, I would say it's a kind of a European project, you know, a combination of 2 knowledge, the Italian side and the French side. This is Flaminio Bertoni in front of an early version of the Citroën DS. Now, the 3rd point is the book that you spoke before, which is called Déesse in DS, Alison Smith in Citroën DS, An Eye on the Road. And I knew this book and published in Delft University, I think 1983. And I knew this book. This was a kind of a hit book, you know, that some people knew. And there was an exhibition in Zurich about English architecture, and I proposed a re-edition of this book to Lars Müller. And the special thing of this car is actually the form of it, because it's actually the form or the layout is the plan of the Citroën. And it was Citroën Netherlands who did pay this kind of cutting, which was quite complicated. So that's the relation. So that's here you have all the information. Actually, the Alison Smith, they were guest professors at the Delft School, and I think it was during this professorship where they proposed to make this book. The publisher then said to me, well, you can make the reprint, but you have to deal with Peter Smithson for the copyright. And as you know, the Smithsons were quite tough. You know, so I wrote to Peter Smithson, and he said, well, who are you? What do you know? And he started to ask questions about the car. And then I went to a friend of me, and I said, I have to get more information about this car. And so, and then we made the book. Peter Smithson was very happy. And at the end, I have two cars, you know, that's the story. So Peter Smithson somehow forced me to deal with these cars. And then I get more and more interested because also as an architect, I like very much the question between form and construction. So this is how I get to this thing. This is what I would like to show you. I would like just to start something about the Déesse DS, and then something, just some aspects about La Déesse, and then about Déesse. And if it works, I would like to show a short film with Lino Ventura by Claude Lelouch from the early 70s. I'm not sure whether it will work because the quality is not very good. Anyway, we will see. Okay, this is the car and the upper lawn pavilion of the Smiths. And actually the book is very simple. It's about the journey with this car to the upper lawn pavilion. And the thesis actually somehow of the Smiths were that the Citroën DS is so calm, you know, with this special hydraulic suspension that you can make drawings. That's the basic idea. So the booklet speaks about these journeys from London to the upper lawn pavilion and then other trips. So this is this beautiful pavilion by the Smiths, very, very famous, recently restored. And this is the Citroën DS. This is Alison Smithson and a photograph by Peter Smithson you see in the glasses here. So that's the kind of the power couple at this time. This is again the car. So this is the outline of the car you see here with the pumps and so on, which is then repeated by the booklet. And it's very funny if you open it, it's like there are like two cars on the thing. Déesse DS and I on the road. And you know, the other book, very important, by Lynch, which has another name because he speaks the view from the road. An interesting thing to think about. So Lynch is the view from the road, 65, and the Smithson is an eye on the road. So it's a slightly different point of view. I show you just very short 5 aspects of the technique of the strategy of the book. So the first, they are photos probably by Peter Smithson's, and these photos, they speak about deepness of space. So it's all about perception of the space by a driving car. And you see the whispers here on the car. So these photos are made of the driving car, and then you see the bridge here, which passes by. So I think the photos are very nice, and they speak about deepness of space, which somehow has to do with deepness of space in the English landscape card. And I will just shortly make a remark later. The second technique is mapping. So Alison Smith, she took from maps, she did cut out pieces of the streets or of the trips they did, and she did include it into the books. Very, very nice. So this book goes from Newbury to Southampton, we see here. It's a kind of cross, and then here it's written from Southampton to Fonthill, Southampton to London. So the book is not only about perception landscape, but she gives at the same time the map to this driving around. Then another technique is the collage. So she combines very often old Roman maps you have here with a car. This is Alison Smithson with her son. And with this car, they went to the Tsiam Congress in Dubrovnik. And then the special whiting. So it's all, the technique is a kind of a collage of the whole thing. Another aspect which I like very much is to work with the text. It's like concrete poetry. This means that the form of the text has something to do with what the text is about. So this is, if you have a look here, we have car gently bounding over the expensive car park, over the sort of ground, the stones will be pulled across and so on. So there was kind of a wave in the street, and then text somehow repeats this kind of feeling by driving the car. The last one and the most important are the sketches. When we were thinking about the reprint, I was not sure about the qualities of these sketches because they don't have the, how to say, the quality like the sketches of Alvaro Siza or Le Corbusier. So I spoke with a landscape architect, and he said that you're right, but they are very precise. You know how she look to the landscape manipulated by infrastructure is very precise. So if you have a look here, you know, this is a landscape, this is a street. Then you have the cut of the street, which gives this figure. So it's a very precise observation of how the street is put into the landscape. And this is the other thing I realized speaking with Peter Smithson. The Smithsons had a huge knowledge of the concept of the English landscape. They were tough and they knew it. And they knew these things, you know, like the aha effect or the pumps and so on. And I think in these drawings, you find this quality, you know, that if you look these drawings here, you are up, you go down, you do not see what is behind that. And then by driving, you discover it. Okay. This very short about this booklet, which I think is a key research, very poetic, also a little bit chaotic, but I think it's an important book 20 years later after the book of Ken Lynch. Now the La Déesse, the Citroën, this is then after making this, making the reprint of the book, I had a lot of information, and then almost 20 years later, I finally did the book about the car. Now, my interest about the car is very simple. It's the question of relation between the inner layout of the technical issues in relation to the form. You know, how far, given the technical, facts, how do they influence the shape or the form, or where do they not influence? So that's, you know, it's not the functionalistic idea, it's much more complex. And I just want to show there in the book, there are different ways to look at it. I just want to show you one. With students from Mendrisio, we bought this car, and then we took it apart. You know, this is what architects like to do, you know, to understand something, like they like to destroy it. And by destroying it, maybe you find out how it is made. What is the key element? And I want to be, with this point of view, I want to say some aspects of the car. And then this is, I called it this tableau. By disassembling the car, we made these photos where we took out some very important elements. Okay, I just go through it. So if you take away the two fenders, you start to understand actually how the car is made. There are elements which are put together. So it's all, this car is all about joining. And it's also very tough. If you take one element out, the whole design of the car is just destroyed, you know. So it's a very homogeneous car. This is one of a very typical iconic elements, namely the fender in front with this huge light here, with lights, and they turn, you know, they call it cat eyes. You see here the technique, and you see the two lights behind, and the strong one turn. No, the other one, I don't remember. So one turns and it follows the street. In fact, it did not work so good because sometimes the light was more in heaven or whatever. But this is a very important car. And what we see is that it's this noise, which was very important for Bertoni. It's an elongated element. The next drawing, this is now a key drawing, because we see the main line of the car. You know, it starts here, very in front of the whole thing, and then it goes up. There's a direct relation to this column related to the glazing to the roof. So this soft line, you know, this coming up, and then we will see, you see later here to the blinkers is one line. So it has a huge noise. And actually this noise is like this because the engineers wanted to put first the engine in front of the wheel. So this was not an invention of the designer. The Flaminio Bertoni was forced to make a huge noise. And then finally it didn't work. And Bertoni somehow liked the form, so he was looking for other reasons to do it like this. Very important are these rubber profiles, you know. This was all very new at this time. So if I said before that there are different elements, the question of bringing them together was all done with this neoprene and all these profiles. So this you see here, if you look carefully, you see these are the profiles of the door and so on. So for me, these kind of drawings were very important because by taking one element out of the car, I think we can say something a car. So this was my analytical point of view, you know, how can I be not too complicated, but to find a direct way who says something about the car. Then the next thing is now already brutal. You see the engine here, and you see what's the name? The tire as collision buffer. I don't know whether you see it because I have my thing over it, whatever. And then we see the combination of the roof, the blinker, and this column here. This is also another icon of the car. So here you have it. And instead of just having a simple column which relates to the body and the roof of it, this is a whole design machine. So it's enlarged. This is the Scharnier, sorry. The Scharnier who connects the back thing. What is it? Joint. The joint here, then the seal, and these are the blinkers. Another icon elements. So with this, I think it's clear that it is a Citroën DS. Now the car is almost empty, and we see the construction. It's a light construction of these two beams you see here. This is all very light, and this is about. So this is a relation to the joinery stuff I told you. And the last photo is quite important. Again, these are the glasses. They are bended, I think. And at this time, this was very, very difficult to do it. So if the car something has to do with streamline, the notion of streamline is repeated in the glasses. And I forgot to say something about the noise, because this car has no radiator anymore. We heard this before from the other colleague, and this at this moment was a shock, because a car has a radiator, and all the technical elements of the radiator were below the car. So this was this engineering from this French engineering from this aviatic engine. Okay, so this is somehow I tried to understand the main contour lines and what is important, and this is the difference to some boring streamline cars, that there is a kind of contradictions. You know, you have lines which you have this kind of line here, and then you have the other one which goes up. Very important, the open wheel in front, which gives the feeling that the car is full, and the back wheel is closed. Okay, just a second remark. It's about the redesign, as I showed you before. And what happened exactly? It's you know, that the car was designed in 55. And then the end of the 60s, the car was a little bit old-fashioned in the sense that elderly people drove the car, and Citroën needed a younger public. So they made it more dynamic. And what they did is that in relation to this light here, they introduced this form here, which today we know, of course, all the cars look like this, but it's another deconstruction, you know, of the classical light form, which is like this, to this one, which is then part of the front sheet. And then the second thing, they moved down here, this element here, to make it more expressive. So by changing the lights and moving down the whole carrosserie, it had this effect that the car became much more younger and faster. What is interesting that on the back end, Citroën didn't change anything. This is absolutely clever, you know. And the Roland Barthes question would then be: is it a new car, or is it still the same? You know, probably what we keep is the structure and the name. Anyway, so this is another thing that in the book I speak quite long. Now, the third one, advertising, I would show you just some elements. If I said, you know, the car is this combination of French engineering and Italian design is one thing. The other thing, and this is the French thing, is how to sell the car, you know, because in 55, this futuristic form was not so easy for the masses. So they took the best agencies to make the car public. And I want to show this in 3 steps. This is a very famous drawing, you know. It is clear because by putting a lot of technical stuff below here, it had this idea that the car is a kind of a flying object, you know, which made it then very avant-garde-like. But what is interesting that it's this flying object, but you have a family aside. This means that they showed that even if this is a futuristic car, this car is a family car, and this was the hardest thing to bring through this message. The second thing, it was completely lifestyle. So they combined textile from the textiles side with colors. They sold it like this. So they said the Citroën is part of lifestyle. It's not just a car, but you are within this. You are part of the lifestyle. The other one, this is just another way, is the hydraulic suspension. There were very different ways to sell it or to explain it, because actually the car is lying in this bubble, and it lies on nitro again. So it's the kind of it lies on the air, and this has been showed in very different ways. Also, like this lady on the matlas and so on. And then one of the main things I already showed you is the glazing, this huge panorama you had, you know. And important is that there's no difference between the front and the back. And they say the front view is 2.2 square meter, which was very, very large, to speak. Now a second group by 63, when the car was already you know, you cannot repeat constantly the same thing. They started a new kind of graphics where they combined, where the text is, that's what I showed before, that's poetry, where the text explained what was the message, you know, so the Frontantrieb, and then the suspension, and this is all this. So what you write here has to do with this kind of how to drive the car, and then of course the wind qualities, and then in the last phase they somehow they stopped to inform to play with the qualities of the car, but they somehow did cut the images of the car. You know, that's somehow the last step in these things. So they do not show anymore the whole car, but they somehow they destroy, or they, by cutting the photos, they made the car, they gave the dynamic to the car. You know, these are the turning line I showed you, and so on. Okay, and then the last image I show is a photo by Helmut Newton, which is very interesting in the sense that here it's only the double row you see, and the gearing wheel here. So these are two elements of the car which were very known. So Citroën just had to show these two elements with this beautiful lady, and then people realize, okay, this must be a Citroën. Now, so this would be these four aspects. Again, AS and DS was the beginning why I was interested in this car, and with this book, somehow my interest is also closed up, you know. I think sorry. Now, I don't know, I have, I would like to try you. No, I know there are some images more. I would like to very shortly speak about the inside of the car, you know, which has again certain icons, like the steering wheel with this very strange organization. It's also this deconstruction actually of an icon, because the steering wheel had a point in the middle, and Citroën did something completely new. And then, of course, these interiors, which they are very, very comfortable. You know, this was very. It's like it's French culture. You know, it's like in a French villa or whatever. So you see it too. This is the early version. This is a later one. Now the film by Claude Lelouch, which I tried to show it another way. I want to show it because he plays inside, more or less inside the car, you know. And that's actually very funny. And I tried to, I just try something, I don't know whether it works. Sorry. What do I have to do? Because I want logo, you know. Well, I try to show it in this way. I'm not sure, the quality is not very good. So it's a film by Claude Lelouch and with Lino Ventura.
Siamo protetti dal governo, non vale la pena di correre così. Ogni volta che lasciamo Parigi ci troviamo nella merda.
Can you hear it?
Yeah, you need to screen share again because we don't see it. You hear it?
Ma porca puttana, dov'è quest'aereo? Me lo vuoi dire? Dov'è? Eccolo. Dove sta? È in questo punto. È dietro. Déesse, dietro di noi. Dai, fa dietro a Frausto. Torna sì, è sulla collina che abbiamo oltrepassato. Torna indietro, dai.
Tenetevi forte.
Mi mantengo, ma torna indietro. Sì, mi mantengo, ma torna indietro. Per la 100ª volta, questa è una falsa evasione. Vai con calma.
We hear, but we don't see the image. So
okay.
can you just screen share again? I think it works. We just don't see the screen.
Let me see.
Sure.
I don't know exactly where I am. Screen share. I think I somehow lost you here. I'll just try. Oh, here we are. So what do we have to do? Bildschirm freigeben.
Yes, and then you go, so you click on your PowerPoint again.
Okay. Here we are.
Yes.
Do you see this?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. No.
Yes.
No. Sorry about this. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
I try, huh?
Siamo protetti dal governo, non vale la pena di correre così. Ogni volta che lasciamo Parigi ci troviamo nella merda, eh?
Can you hear
sì,
it?
Ma questa volta no, sono stati di una tale serenità. Ci hanno organizzato un'evasione coi fiocchi. Ci hanno promesso l'acqua.
Can you see it?
Yeah, perfect.
Ma porca puttana, dov'è quest'aereo? Me lo vuoi dire? Dov'è? Eccolo. Dove sta? È in questo punto. È dietro. Déesse, dietro di noi. Dai, fa dietro a Frausto. Torna sì, è sulla collina che abbiamo oltrepassato. Torna indietro, dai.
Tenetevi forte.
Mi mantengo, ma torna indietro. Mi mantengo, ma torna indietro. Per la 100ª volta, questa è una falsa evasione. Vai con calma. Ci ammazzeremo, cretino. Porca vacca. Aldo, te l'ho detto, te l'ho spiegato appena adesso, non c'è nessuno. Vai più piano, c'è tempo. Eccoli qua. È incredibile. Fermati. Fermati.
Ma no, è il momento di pestare questo.
E io ti dico di fermarti.
E io ti dico che li seminiamo.
Fermati! Ora gli spieghiamo tutto. Non avete visto lo stop? Lo stop. Lo stop, sì. Avete visto uno stop?
No, dove? Veramente io l'ho visto.
Dove? Là, a 150 metri.
Non ci sono stop.
Non ci sono stop, gente. Sì. Diglielo.
Oh.
Senta, signora gente.
Spiegati chiaro, avanti.
Questa macchina non è nostra, questa è una macchina del governo. Lo vedete quell'aereo? Anche quell'aereo laggiù è del governo. E noi dobbiamo prendere quell'aereo per andare in Africa, perché qui non ci vogliono più, bisogna andarsene. Già, ora provaci tu.
Dunque, questo vero è un problema africano, chiaro? Anzitutto è un problema africano, perché i vostri padroni, noi siamo d'accordo con i vostri padroni, hanno detto organizziamo tutto noi e hanno organizzato, però ci hanno detto in Africa ci andate voi ci bloccate, voi ci bloccate e loro ci hanno sbloccato e fate male, sapete perché? Perché? Ma perché voi andate contro i vostri interessi, lo capite questo, no? Perché sono loro che ci chiedono di andare in Africa.
Ma se vi diciamo che loro ci hanno sbloccato e non è che ci bloccate quando noi siamo stati sbloccati.
Via, lui non può spiegarvelo perché è un nevropatico ricorrente.
I think we can stop here. Is that okay? Okay. Did you see at least something, or is?
Yes, it was very nice.
Sorry about the quality.
No, the quality was pretty good. Thank you very much for the talk. Yeah, can we open it up to some people who may have questions? Well, maybe I can kick off So you started off with this, well, the reprint, right? The re-edition. But did you have an obsession with the DS before this? Or it became a kind of obsession afterwards?
No, my obsession was how to deal with Peter Smithson. That's what and it was very interesting. You know, he had huge knowledge about the car, and so it was this combination of English landscape garden and this car. You know, this was a little bit unexpected. So my interest actually. I knew the car before, but you know, the Citroën is a very classical car of architects. But there was no special ambitions in the sense that I was interested in the theme, you know, between the construction and the form, the shape of the form, and to understand the form not so much as a, how to say, iconic or the iconographic way, but in a direct way, you know, with this kind of gestalt quality. And now the car, I gave the car to the Museum of Modern Art, and its exhibition, it showed there, so that's great for me. So the story is just gone, you know, that's it. Yeah.
It's complete.
Yeah, it's complete. Thank you.
Michael, you had a comment or question?
I had a question, if that's
great. Nishi.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. I was really intrigued by the technique of deconstruction that you use to represent the car and to bring out the symbolic elements of the car in a way. So my question was just, how did you come up with this technique of representation? Was it inspired by something? Or because even one of the advertisements that you showed towards the end, I think it was the last one where there were these cutting images just highlighting. So that was also, I thought, like it very well complemented what you were doing with the car also.
No, you're completely right. I know the theoretical work of Peter Eisenman, I know it quite well, you know. And Eisenman, what he does, you know, if he takes, let's say, the Le Corbusier domino, for instance, he takes a work from Le Corbusier and then he starts to manipulate it, you know. He starts to move the columns and so on. So this manipulation, or how to say, the problem how to understand an object or a house, to manipulate it, to understand it. This was a kind of basic idea I have in head since long. So in Mendrisio we had the diploma, and we proposed to make a museum for Flaminio Bertoni, and then with the money I get from the school to organize the diploma, I bought this car. And this was a big shock. You know, I got a phone call from the administration, said, what the hell is going on? And I said, yeah, we will take it away. And this is research. So, well, I think it's architects like this kind of take apart, or maybe like children too. And then you are surprised because we were surprised about the quality of these tableaus that we could make. You know, I thought we take all the parts away, but then when we started to arrange certain points of it, it was clear that within 10 images you can explain, you can say a lot about the car. And this is my interest in research. You know, what is the directest way to understand something? You know. I don't know. Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a good. It's in my heart. These things. Yeah.
I have a question about the production of this book. I mean, the original version, as well as the reissue, they were printed or cut out in this very peculiar way, right? And as you said, it's not easy or cheap to make it in such a way. And at the same time, I think it's very interesting that they chose the, let's say, the top view of the car, not the silhouette from the side, in which you would really, well, that's the recognizable shape, I would say, of this car. Of course, it would work in a very different way, but what are your thoughts on making this book, in process of making this book, about the role of this this cutout, this choice in graphic design or bookmaking?
Well, for me it was easy because it's a reprint, so there was no way to change anything. And good question, because my whole analysis of the main part works with the silhouette. But very lately, and I did not speak about, I found out that actually the plan is as important as the silhouette. It has to do because, they sail the car like a ship which goes through water. And this you see in the Grundriss, in the plan. You don't see so much in, and so it's that's, and I don't know why this. I think there's a pragmatic reason now. If the shape of the book would be the silhouette, you cannot put it somewhere. That it just doesn't work. So you need a certain symmetry, and I think it shows also the flow of speed or something like that. They never wrote about this thing, but it's the plan. I mean they were architects, so they said, let's take the plan. But it's a good point, and but I think the pragmatic reason, it's very nice because with the two pumps it has, you can even put it into the library and it doesn't fall apart. So it's a kind of a reuse of two elements of the car, if you want.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Christian. It's time to go on to our next lecture, which will be given by Even Smith Wergeland, who is an associate professor at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, and his scholarship engages with the car as a driver for architecture and urban design. So his scholarly research has dealt with the post-war period, but at the same time now, his work is, he's very much involved in the present, the car in the present of Oslo. So we're very happy to have him share his thinking with us on the past and future of the car, the love affair of the car, past and present. And also we would just like to thank him that he, for the great effort he made to be able to join us today and be part of the symposium, readjusting his schedule in order to be here. So we very much appreciate that commitment. The screen is yours, Evan.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me well?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. I'm very delighted to be here. And as you said, it's my partner's 40th birthday today. So I had to make certain rearrangements to save my marriage to be able to be here. But of course, the car deserves a level of commitment. Before I start, I would like to admit a sin. This is my copy of the reissue. It's supposed to be this color, but I left it in my office one summer and forgot to shut the blinders. So if you happen to buy an edition of this, do forget to keep it tucked away safely. But it's it's a great book, and I love the reissue.
This is the original edition, so it almost it's a bit bipolar.
It's
here.
like a hybrid of the first.
Yeah,
and the
hybrid
one.
here.
Yeah. Anyhow,
that's the idea that because Alison Smith wanted it to have red first, and then so we do it red, and it's just by time it becomes blue again. So that's
I see. Yeah. Well, it still looks beautiful. Anyhow, I'll share my screen. So the title is The Love for the Car, Then and Now. I'm going to get back to the Autotopia at which we started during the first lecture. The Utopia of the 50s and 60s and the connection to the still living utopia of today's car industry and the role of the car in contemporary architecture and planning. Most of the stuff I'm going to talk about is based on a big research project that I was a part of when I did my doctoral thesis at the Oslo School of Architectural Design. The project was called Routes, Roads and Landscapes, and it was a multidisciplinary study of all things infrastructural and mobility through history, from the Danish king's travel in Norway in the 18th century, through my study of post-war infrastructure to contemporary studies of the same theme. So if you want to know more about this, we published a book on Ashgate in 2011 called Routes, Roads and Landscapes, which captures much of the stuff we did. And the project also generated 2 PhD projects, including mine, which was called From Utopia to Reality, the Motorway as a Work of Art, which deals with a lot of different things, but it's essentially a study of how urban mobility was visualized across a number of fields in the post-war period, from planning and architecture, of course, but also in the movies, in music, in popular culture. The main part of my research was done on Norwegian material in this particular time period. And the main document of the whole thing was this one here, the transport analysis for the Oslo region, which was published in 1965 by the planning department in Oslo. And this is essentially a document that sees the entire city of Oslo from a transport perspective and a mobility perspective. It's known for many things, but this illustration here is probably the most notorious of the whole scheme. It shows the possible future for Oslo with an 8-lane urban motorway called the Urban Motorway, passing directly through the city center. This image here is particularly known because what the building you see in the background is actually the Royal Palace of Oslo and the Royal Palace Park. So the fact that they kind of teamed up the motorway with one of the most known buildings in the city says something about the ambition of this project. The motorway itself was never built, but it was kind of the launching platform for the car city that we have today with the ring roads and everything infrastructural. But as you can see in this illustration, it also foresaw the future as a kind of coexistence between cars and pedestrians. So I think it's also important to think about the post-war period, not just in terms of car-based infrastructure, but for a broader interest in mobility in the city, which I will return to. What I was investigating in my thesis were a couple of key questions. Where did these ideas come from? Why did the city of Oslo decide to move in this direction? And in what ways were the architects involved during the golden era of car-based planning? Because up until my research, this has had pretty much been an engineering history, and all the credit and also all the blame had been kind of handed over to the engineers a lot. And the third question, which I'm going to tackle at the end of my presentation, is why is this relevant today? Because I think it is for many reasons, and I hope you follow my arguments on that. But let's get to the then first. Obviously, a lot of these impulses that came to not just Oslo, but any city in Norway came from what I've chosen to call American Carchitecture. Exhibitions such as the Futurama Magic Motorways, shown during the World Fair in New York, obviously deals with combinations of roads and high-rise buildings, so impressive architecture mixed with impressive roads. And of course, the fact that the Americans were already building such roads in the middle of cities. One of the most known and debated examples are the Cross Bronx Expressway in New York City. So obviously a lot of Norwegian professionals went to the States to study such structures, and they came back and adopted those ideas to the Norwegian context. Another really important influence was interwar modernism, and Le Corbusier in particular. He went to Oslo in 1933 to lecture on his mobility systems, including this one here that you may know, his system of 7 roads, which was the basis of his infrastructural plan for Chandigarh and other projects in the 50s. This got adapted to an Oslo-based version by a Canadian architect called Robert Esdale, who met a Norwegian woman and moved to Norway and had most of his practice as an architect there. He simply redrew the system and pasted it onto the existing urban structure in Oslo. So this is a very concrete example of a connection between a known idea and the architectural and planning practice in Oslo. It also came from various examples from European architecture. Norwegian architects went to Italy, they went to Germany, they went to England, and this guy in particular, Erik Rolfsen, went on several study trips to Berlin in the late 1950s, and he came back with sketches like this. He's driving around Berlin and making sketches of impressive infrastructural landmarks. He is a key person because he was the head of planning in Oslo during this whole time period. So he was basically in charge of the transport analysis that eventually got political approval in the late 1960s. Another example of huge importance is the development of British new towns and the whole concept of regional planning across Europe in the 1950s and 60s, when a lot of cities were managing population overspill in the inner city by moving people from the city center to suburbia. In Oslo, we call these new neighborhood satellite towns, but you know, as you are probably quite aware, they have different names across Europe, but that was a known strategy at the time. And of course, the car played a huge role in that, moving people out, building new roads, connecting the inner city and the outer centers. So this English material, the Greater London Plan from 1944, the British Newtown Act from 1946, and the completed projects like Communal Newtown outside Glasgow and Milton Keynes, they were all over the architectural journals in Norway at the time, and Norwegian architects went to study trips to see this. On the other hand, there were also interesting examples of more experimental schemes on print in Norway at the time. This is an extremely interesting example, I find, the Spatial City by the French architect Jonas Friedman, who not only had his projects appear in journals in Norway, but he also traveled to Norway to lecture at the Oslo Architectural Association in 1963. Some of his texts on mobility were translated into Norwegian and so on. So this is a mixture of course, we can see some cars here at the bottom, but the whole point about this city is not just the car in itself, it's the idea of mobility governing architecture and governing city, creating flexibility and so on. Another important group who have already been mentioned in the form of Alison and Peter Smithson is Team 10, who in my opinion invented a very radical form of mobility based on the whole idea of the individually owned motor car. And I'm quoting Alison and Peter Smithson here from an article in Architectural Design. Mobility has become the characteristic of our period. Social and physical mobility, the feeling of a certain sort of freedom, is one of the things that keep our society together. And the symbol of this freedom is the individually owned motor car. So this whole rhetoric hit the scene and it made a huge impact in Norway. Peter Smithson himself lectured in Norway at various places in the early 1960s. And as you can see from this quote by a Norwegian architect called Jung Eng, it's all almost word by word the same. The car satisfies our deeply rooted thirst for liberty, freedom, wanderlust, our desire for contact with other people. Also, the car has a significant advantage compared to other means of transport because it is individual. So this whole belief in the car, which I'm sure you know from before, really manifested itself in the debate about architecture and planning in Norway in this time period. And it quickly affected practice. This is one example that appeared on the front page of a newspaper in March 1960, Dagbladet, which is one of the bigger newspapers in Norway. Two architects are proudly presenting their latest work, which is a huge motorway artery in 3 levels, moving directly through the city center of Oslo. So what this building here is the Parliament building. It was going to be saved so that the politicians and diplomats could access it really efficiently by car, but otherwise it would have raised really important part of the city center. But what I found really fascinating about this project is that they believe in it not just from a practical point of view, but they also believe in the aesthetics of it. Like they say themselves, Oslo could become the only modern city in Europe so far that is fundamentally based on modern principles of both practical and aesthetic character. And in my research, of course, I found it really interesting that the architects were believing not not just in the efficiency of roads and cars, but the aesthetic that came along with it. Another example from the same year is this so-called traffic viaduct by an architect called Håkon Mjelva, who wanted to solve the traffic problems at Oslo Town Hall Square by this elevated system of roundabouts. And you can sort of understand the way he thought from the context at the time, because the town hall was full of cars and it was a huge problem. And the belief, of course, at the time is that, okay, we have to deal with it as architects or engineers. So the solution is to kind of accept the fact that the car is there, and then you build a system for it. So you kind of instrumentalize it in a way. This is what the place looks like today, and I think everyone in Oslo is quite pleased that we don't have cars there anymore. We have a tram line, and it's pretty much an open space. But I think it's important also to understand what they were trying to deal with in the 60s, because we can blame the architects for the proposal, but it was a difficult thing at the time. So just to summarize, before I get to a more contemporary perspective, in my thesis, I kind of concluded that there was a notable mutual interest across professions in Norway at this point in time. And the inspiration did come from a lot of different places. It was not just American engineering, it was architecture from different parts of Europe. It was theories about mobility and so on. And it was the potential of mobility as an artistic expression as well. And the aesthetic appreciation of the motorway spread across time and space through a very intricate circulation with images. I mean, it was not just about planning images being read by planners, but it was the whole fascination with the car and the infrastructure that followed along with it in movies and so on that kind of inspired these schemes. And through all this, car culture got institutionalized, and the car sort of became the norm for urban mobility from this stage and onwards. However, if we look into the 70s, we also see that a lot of architects and other people involved wanted to distance themselves from the car explosion of the post-war period, because we're getting into a new way of thinking about the environment and so on. So at the turn of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, you see books like this coming out a lot in Norway, The War on Traffic, which was published in 1970 by an architect called Jan Carlsen and his colleague Hans Magnus Ystgaard, which is, well, it's typical for its time because it's a Marxist critic of the car. You know, it's left-oriented, obviously politically, and the car has moved quite quickly from being the savior of the city to being the symbol of greed, pollution, and collective slavery, at least according to this book. But this is kind of the mentality we are facing from the 70s and onwards. The car is no longer regarded professionally as the thing you should prioritize. But I find it interesting, if we move it to the second part, that there is a big paradox involved in this. On the one hand, the car sort of became the public enemy number one in the 1970s. Most publications have titles like this: Autokind versus Mankind. There's a differentiation between humans and cars, apparently. But if you look at the actual development of European cities in the 80s and 90s, that's when the actual car dependence only increased. And it's true for Oslo. Oslo abandoned the motorway project, but kept building more and more roads. And the situation today is that we are building compact cities to stimulate more use of public transport. That's a model you see in a lot of European cities. But society continues to encourage car use as well. So that's a big paradox. And I'm going to show some examples from Norway. I have a little list there. So from one point of view, most of the cities are getting denser, and we want more people to live close to, you know, subway stations and so on. But cars are still allowed extensively below ground. We are building these enormous tunnels and parking spaces. So you're kind of, you're not encouraged to use your car, but you're allowed to have it. And a lot of transport planning research shows that if people are given the license to drive, they will do it. The other paradox is that cities or metropolitan areas are getting denser, but we are building super expensive car infrastructure at regional level. This image here shows one of the subsea tunnel projects in my home county of Rogaland, which basically allows anyone who lives on an island to use the car directly into the mainland. they're super expensive, and they generate more car use. So what's the point of densifying the city if the region is gathering cars? Another paradox has more to do with social issues. A lot of research has been invested in the fact that families with small children are often against car traffic because of safety issues and so on. But they use the car more frequently than other social groups because it's very practical, of course, for them. And you see that with a lot of car advertisement. They are normally directed at families. And of course, there are only one car on the road and so on. So it looks really smooth as well. But that's very interesting. Another fact from Norwegian research is that a lot of people use the car even if it's more expensive and slower than public transport, because they find it convenient, practical, and enjoyable. You know, some people simply love to use their car regardless of the economic and practical obstacles involved. And that kind of leads me to my major point, because transport planning traditionally is a very rational discourse. It treats traffic as the act of getting from A to C as quickly as possible. But if you look at how people choose to move about, it often has a lot more with emotions and cultural preferences. And one really interesting researcher I've been referencing a lot is the American sociologist Mimi Scheller, who talks about emotive mobility, which has to do with emotions and how people move about every day. And she has a list of reasons why a lot of people feel connected to the car. And one is because it's, as we've talked about already, it's an extension of the home and the family. You know, Alison Smithson's book on the DS it's mainly her on a family trip, and that probably goes for a lot of people who use the car. It's also a private space. You can get away from your family if you think they're awful people. You get a moment for yourself and a break from society. It's very different from being on a bus where you have to relate to other people. It provides a feeling of individuality. You can put your own music on. You can create your own interior. You can, you can make your own little private box. And it does provide an element of comfort, even in a queue. Queues are often treated as negative factors only in transport research, but for a lot of people, a queue can also be a moment to listen to your favorite podcast or even play your guitar. There was an incident last year in Oslo where a famous musician was stopped by the police when he was playing his guitar in a queue. And it's generally, the car is a highly personal affair. And that's why a lot of people react strongly when restrictions are applied against car use, which I will get to in a moment. Because I think a lot of the students in the architecture schools now are working on visions of the future that typically look like this. You know, everything is green. It's based on alternative energy sources. It's based on walking. It's based on bicycling and so on. And that's why a lot of visions from around the world. This is a project called Sport in the Port from New York. You're supposed to jog to work. You're supposed to take your canoe. You're supposed to take your bicycle. And the latest big project in Oslo, which is called Hovenbyen, is all about the same thing. It's green, it's pedestrian friendly, it's bicycle friendly, and so on. The problem, as we've seen over the past few years, and this is my final slide, is that a lot of people don't really buy into this green feature. We kind of know that this is the correct version of what an environmental friendly city should look like. But the problem is that a lot of people still use their car. And when that right is taken from them by some means, they end up in the streets. There was a campaign, some form of national rebellion against road tolls in Norway in 2019, which had a huge impact on the election. It even initiated the start of a whole new political party exclusively devoted to the issue of kind of saving the car. And what I found really interesting about this whole campaign is that it's not just that they love cars in general, it's that they specifically want to drive fossil fuel cars in the city. So cars that run on gasoline. So they're actually also I mean, they fight for the right to drive, but they also fight against technological development in other aspects of the industry, like electric cars and bikes. And I think this definitely has a parallel to the movement that you probably know much better, the so-called yellow vests in France, which was, of course, a big social movement. It was never just about cars, but cars and transport was a big part of this debate, because it got it got connected to private cars, private economy, and particularly the working classes. And my point is that if we want to take the car seriously, because it's very much still here, we have to take these movements seriously as well. We have to know the reasons why people move out into the street to protest, and we have to know more about the attitudes that lay behind such movements. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, like I was saying, the car has pretty much been the norm since the 1950s and 60s. And for many people, it remains the norm. And I think that's often overshadowed in books about green urbanism and so on, where the car is always treated as something that everybody wants to get rid of. But that's, when reality hits, that's simply not the case. Right, okay. So that ends my presentation, and I'll unshare my screen.
Thank you very much, Evan. Do people have some thoughts or questions, reflections? Maybe I can kick off. Maybe within this, well, we're not really post-pandemic yet, but in our current situation, I think the privacy of the car has taken more preference. I'm just curious for your thoughts on this, related to your last statements about the future of the car, and how you think that this, our contemporary situation may actually increase car usage and the independence and privacy that is attached to it. In counterpart to the, let's say, the reduction in fuel emissions and things like this that have been going on more and more. How do you think in such a progressive society as in Norway, this may change things?
To answer the last question first, I think it came as a bit of a surprise that the car movement would be so strong, especially in the bigger cities, where you kind of imagine that the population would be mostly in favor of green initiatives and so on. Mm-hmm. But I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the car remains unrivaled when it comes to individuality. I mean, you can have your own car and you can drive whenever you want to. Of course, that's not true, because you're hampered by other drivers all the time. But there's a strong belief in the benefit of that. And even for a lot of people who live in the city and they live close to big subway stations and so on, they still need the car for various small practical things like getting the groceries or so on. So I think it's a very complex issue to deal with. And one reason why politicians aren't pressing harder on car use is the fact that they know the car is popular. So we only have one political party in Norway, which is, 100% car hostile, the Green Party, which is kind of, it's growing a lot, but they're also creating a big polemic every time they get in position, because they want to, for instance, remove all the private cars from the inner city in Oslo. So there are many people who love that, but there are as many people who hate it. So I think a lot of the more, let's say, centrally placed political parties, they have to kind of be careful what they do to the voters. And I think it also explains why we are densifying cities, but still allowing the car to have a place, which to me kind of makes densification a lot less efficient, because if the idea is that you are going to have more people around a traffic node, you shouldn't allow them. That should be the only reason why we are building taller and denser structures. Taller and denser structures do not help in themselves in terms of saving the environment, but it will help if we can prevent car use. So, but I think you have to understand the political complexity of making that choice in order to understand the status of the car. And as for future solutions, I probably, I mean, once we are moving a little bit away from this very polemic phase that we are in now, because we have a whole generation still who are used to having the car as a very natural ingredient, maybe 20 years into the future, at least, let's call them the car segment, they will probably be more positive towards other forms of individual transport. Maybe it doesn't have to be their own car. So in Oslo, for instance, there is a growing forest of car sharing companies and so on. And personally, I think that's probably something that's going to expand here.
Mm-hmm. Philip, I was wondering if you had any thoughts or comments as well, somebody who loves the car and loves the highway.
One before you typecast me any further, I was wondering if I guess in the rest of Europe or in the maybe imagination of Norway, the insistence on the, let's say, this electric car use and I think the fastest outphasing of certain fossil fuel things and the special high occupancy vehicle lanes for hybrid and whatnot, these kind of policies. I was wondering if there is a kind of particular mix in environmental concerns regarding emissions, but not an insistence necessarily on this public transportation, to kind of find an alternative private vehicular system that might be sort of net emission free theoretically. And then as a second part of that question, because I think it always is added to that discussion, that maybe that protest or the protest movement you were talking about, which often, of course, we think it is this kind of urban versus rural opposition, and which I think is a kind of, I think, wrong characterization to a certain extent, because it's just as much a socio-economical problem that would occur in the larger metropolitan areas, you know, as
I think you're absolutely right in terms of the socio-economics, because what was surprising during the last election was the fact that the rebellion was bigger in the cities and smaller on the countryside. Right. And there isn't so much talk about the car in the countryside because it's, I mean, it's generally accepted that it's there. It's very difficult with a country like Norway, where you have huge distances everywhere to get a public transport system. And also to provide infrastructure for electric cars. It's kind of utopian with all the, you know, Oslo is one thing where you have a million people plus, but once you move up into the mountain, it's getting difficult. So the surprising thing was this whole new discussion on preferences, economy, family life, that I think a lot of my colleagues thought we had concluded that discussion like 20 years ago, and we were all moving towards the green future. But as it happens, we're not. So I think there's a lot of rethinking going on now based on the political rebellion that we saw. And maybe that's going to happen elsewhere in many cities in Europe as well. I mean, because we saw some of the same reactions from some of the same groups. And I also think it showed a particular kind of will to rebel against the state. I mean, there's something about the state or the municipality wanting to overrun your needs. And again, to a certain segment of the population, that's negative, regardless of whether it's the car or if it's something else. They just don't want to be ruled. And there is one political party in Norway that's been growing over the past 20 years, which is very much about, you know, the individual need rather than the collective. So I think that's also something. I mean, you have to see the politics in that too in order to understand it. But I think we've learned a lesson here that we are not necessarily as progressive as we like to think ourselves, even though we have a strong tradition for environmentalism and so on.
Yeah, and one other comment that was often raised in this respect is the kind of structure of our, how do you call it, our sort of emissions religion on how we calculate things, and that in the case of Norway, the kind of footprint is sort of exported in a sense that the high reliance on the kind of batteries, etc., would sort of move which sort of would create somewhere far away another problem, probably even including emissions and all kinds of extractive practices, which would be another thing. So I think it's an interesting case because it's so developed, to kind of understand the kind of real footprint of any kind of decision. And another thing, I don't know, Salomon, if there is time. Just a short thing about, let's say there is one, the kind of, which I think is very interesting, or was very interesting in your lecture, is the kind of behavioral side about how the kind of use itself and how it sort of shapes a kind of societal paradigm. And the other side is, let's say, the kind of physical presence or the reification of that in an infrastructural network. And I think there is all kinds of other aspects tied to that, which I think in the Oslo case seem to be interesting as well. I mean, I've always been, I don't know if you know the Ole Singstad, this Norwegian-American engineer. I think he left Norway quite young, and he was responsible for, I think, most of the sub-water tunnels, water tunnels everywhere in the world. He built one in my city. He is responsible for the ventilation system of the Holland Tunnel in New York. Sort of kind of really conceptually responsible for something that then much decades later becomes really relevant. Kind of network idea also in the Norwegian context. But I think more, if you would focus on the city and infrastructure as a presence, I think it has all kinds of unintended effects which are difficult to judge. I mean, in my opinion, the most brutal presence of some infrastructures in cities sometimes is the only thing that stops an area from radically gentrifying and gives some precariat still the possibility to live in a near proximity to the city. So once the highway gets removed, the people get removed. Well, before, the people got removed because the highway was built. Now the people get removed because the highway is removed. So the same sort of dynamic seems the same thing. The construction companies are basically heavily invested with the same amounts of concrete in sort of undoing the infrastructural city, like building sort of tunnels and all kinds of things which have the same effect as the infrastructure before, but in order to have the pedestrian zone cross, let's say, so I think there is implicit contradictions.
Absolutely, and the only general conclusion I've come across during my years of doing infrastructural research is that infrastructure always play a huge role, but it can be very unpredictable as well. Like you say, I mean, funnily enough, one of the bigger projects that will go on in Oslo for the next 5 years is the final removal of an old piece of road that cuts through the city. And I like your description because that road contains probably the only 3 affordable bars in the center of town, which of course creates a certain social problem as well. But it's like the only place left for people who are not kind of in the upper middle classes and so on. So once that road is gone, it's probably then the city is the gentrification is complete in a sense. But I also just briefly, I mean, the whole problem of what you extract, I think that's what we're going to discuss a lot in the next years, because Norway is an extraction country. You know, we extract oil, we extract power from a lot of natural resources, and we in many ways just squander them. So maybe the car isn't the biggest problem after all. Maybe it's the general way we waste resources. And what I normally teach in the architecture school is reuse of buildings and so on. And probably there's a lot more to gather there maybe than from necessarily preventing car use. But the most important thing, I guess, is to see the bigger picture of how all these things kind of work together towards a more or less sustainable future.
Thank you, Evan.
Great. Thank you very much, Evan. We'd like to continue now onto our final talk, which will be given by Bert Voet, who is a journalist and co-author of the book called Carchitecture, which explores the way architecture and car design intersect. We're very pleased to have Bert here to give a short presentation on the contents of the book, to flip through the book and to outline some of the ideas. The book is well, we're very fond of it, and we're glad that you are able to be here with us in this way.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for having me. Before I start talking, I must say that I am, as I mentioned when we did the agreement for the lecture, I'm not a big specialist in architecture. My co-author Déesse, Déesse de Meulemeester, he is the architect guy, but he could not be here today. I collaborated on the book because I am the car guy. So I will introduce the book. I will briefly tell about what we did. But afterwards, I will mainly dive into cars, and I do some talking about cars, mainly defending the thesis that the car is in fact the most expressive and the most psychologically and sociologically meaningful consumer object in history. It might be relevant given the other lectures, Evan, what Evan just was talking about. I think diving a bit deeper into cars might be relevant. What we did in our book, Carchitecture, is we sourced, basically to start with, we sourced images of iconic buildings and iconic cars. We did that mainly online. Unfortunately, we didn't have the budget to travel the world ourselves, but two journalists and a photographer and look for buildings and cars ourselves. So we sourced images, and we searched for similarity, in fact, between a car and a building. That was one thing. The similarity could be in architectural style and in the form of a car, but also in the character of the car. Brutalism and a brutally designed car like the Maserati Biturbo is evident, but also contrasting images were a possibility. An Alfa Romeo Tipo 33 looks sleek, fine and shaped, but underneath, in fact, it's a brutal beast. So it's perfect for a chapter on brutal power. Other chapters on our classical gas, contemporary architecture, European modernism, and space race. Apart from that, we have written some essays on Art Deco, when it's the whole ecosystem in which one searches for the perfect machine. Another essay is on how the car became Frank Lloyd Wright's ultimate muse. We also research why Le Corbusier might better have called Le Carbusier, and why, that's one which I wrote myself, why Saab was the ultimate architect's car. The lecture of Christian was very interesting. Maybe the Citroën DS is a car which is loved a lot by architects, but it's a stereotype, of course. But the Saab as a brand is linked very often to architects, and I think that is because there are many reasons. I think Saab has everything what architects are looking for. They are a bit artistic. Saab is like a mixture between a Volvo, which is safe and strong. It's a bit of a Mercedes, which is solid and reliable, and it has the sportiness of a BMW. In the 80s, the Saabs, the turbos were very quick. So a Saab was not necessarily better than its competitors, but it was very different. And it was very Scandinavian, of course, which is something architects love. It was well built, durable, stylish, but not in your face, and very well designed. The U-Saab in 1947 was a miracle of aerodynamics. Saabs were also very, very functional. Also, the interior is very ergonomic. The curved windshield, which is very famous, gives a better view on the road. There are little details like the ignition key, who is in between the front seats, so it's next to you, because you cannot damage your knee in case of a collision. So very smart designed cars, obsessed with safety. Saab was one of the safest cars on earth in its time. So that makes it the architect car. Now, as I mentioned, I would like to go a bit deeper into the signification of cars. As a journalist in 2014, I started visiting car collectors for Sabato, which is a weekend magazine of the Belgian business newspapers, De Tijd and L'Echo. And since then, in the past 7 years, I estimate to have visited about 250 car collectors, which give a lot of insight in what cars mean, also in society, not only for car freaks, but also in society. And we visited big collections as of 50, 70 last week. I was in Holland visiting a collection of more than 150 cars, but also very small collections, well chosen. And sometimes it was only a story. It was a story about only one car. Like, for example, there it is again, a Citroën DS of a man in Brussels who only had that car and who drove it as a daily car since 1972, which was at the moment for about 45 years or so. I also visited a collector who owned a Bugatti that he received, a car that he received from his godfather when he was 18. And when I visited him, he was 82 and he still drove that car. I use these examples just to say that I am focusing, when I look for car stories, I'm focusing on the bonding between people and their cars. And that brings us to the question, why is the car the most important consumer object in history, as I stated before? The answer is in the enormous layered identity of a car. Cars are the most layered object in terms of signification that has ever existed. And of course, it starts with mobility, but that's only one layer. To say that cars bring us from A to B, that's like saying that clothes protect us against cold weather. They do, of course, but clothes do much more than that, and cars do much more than clothes. In the beginning of motoring, at the end of the 19th century, much more than a revolution in mobility, cars were a new way of expressing prestige. They were the ultimate symbol at the time of the industrial era, the modernism, and a symbol of wealth. It was a peacock tail, if you want, which was also used for seduction. We have two layers, mobility and prestige, but there's many, many more. The aesthetics, as you know, cars are sculptures. Some collectors can watch for hours today cars. Some of them don't drive their cars, they only watch their cars. In the book, we have an essay on Art Deco cars, which are to many the most beautiful cars ever made. Bugatti has made them. Talbot Lago has the very famous Art Deco cars. I think there is a very popular Facebook group on which every day the most amazing Art Deco cars are appearing. So aesthetics, it's evident, is a very important layer. Also, the physical enjoyment of driving is another layer. The sound of an engine is described by many as music, of which they literally get goosebumps. So also the speed, the feeling of controlling a car generates enjoyment in our brain system. It's driving fast, taking a difficult turn, brings measurable physiological reactions and intense emotions in our brains. There is the intellectual pleasure and the challenges of understanding a car engine. Working on it is fun as well. Progress of cars, technique, it's another layer. There is the idea, the before mentioned idea of freedom. Cars, of course, made fast and flexible traveling possible for people, also for ordinary people. Which is a big freedom aspect, but also the earlier mentioned the car as a personal cocoon is important as well. We should be aware that often a car is the only real personal space, the real personal space of their own that people have. And that is not to underestimate. It's one of the reasons why people prefer to stand in a traffic jam in their car instead of taking public transports. The notion of freedom, recently I was talking to a big car collector. He told me that his wife is also very passionate about cars and that they often drive together. But the most fun, the most pleasure for him is driving alone on his own and with no place to go. Just driving, following little roads without a destination. And that is exactly what young people do when they have their freshly acquired driving license. They just go and drive with no particular place to go. An important one is the layer of it's important to notice that also people who are not passionate about cars or who say that they are not attached to cars in any way, also these people, they give them names. They give names to their car, they caress their cars, And on family pictures, cars are often centrally positioned as it were family members and travel companions. Travel pictures, often the car is there. There is another important layer on its own, it's racing cars. In racing cars, there is the notion of competition, machismo, impressing, a kind of survival of the fittest or survival of the fastest in this case. The risk of death involved is in some way attractive as well. We see that in art everywhere. The risk, death, is attracting people. But racing is also a clear example of what the American economist and sociologist Thorstein Veblen used to call, in the 19th century, he used to call that conspicuous wastes. So racing, it's like an equivalent for the potlatch of the North American tribes. They organized ritual feasts during which they destroy their possessions just to show off wealth and status. And that's in fact what racing is as well. It shows that cars are used to organize rituals. People come together to honor their cars or car brands. They tell each other myths about, just to name a few, Enzo Ferrari and Ettore Bugatti, like they were gods in religions. So rituals is another important layer. Cars are cultural icons with a national identity. German, English, French cars, Italian cars, they all have their own character, and that goes with certain emotions. Love, but also disdain. It brings a lot of debate. Cars are personalized, and I could go on. All those layers make cars so powerful in our culture. I come back to the collectors. Collecting is, in fact, it's, if it were cars or something else, collecting is always a mental strategy to change greed into a sort of a meaningful desire. Patiently hunting for a specific car for decennia can do that. I know a collector who wrote season's greetings from Belgium to South Africa during 25 years. Every year at Christmas he wrote a card, and under the season's greetings he wrote, if one day if you want to buy your car, it was a Berlage, please call me. And that happened after 25 years. He could use the car and add it to his collection of about 30 Belages. So for many car collectors, an expensive car is not enough. And that brings us to a very particular part of car passion. Being expensive is not enough. Sometimes it's not even important. Cars must carry stories of people. And I'm going to give some examples. A collector I know, he could buy a BSA, an English car, a three-wheeler in fact, which was not very special on its own, except that the previous English owner, he drove this car for his entire life. So the man has pictures of that owner when he was 20 years old next to his three-wheeler, and the same man 65 years later next to the same three-wheeler. So it was a rather banal car, but with the story like this, it becomes extremely special. And if you can buy it and add it to your collection, it's a big thing. Another collector I saw, it's an amazing story as well. he's about 60 years old now, and he still drives the MGA in which he left the maternity hospital as a baby with his father. So they are totally one, the car and its owner. There is also, I recently saw, there often, car collectors often talk about fully documented cars. Well, recently I got to see a fully documented Porsche, but fully documented in the sense that not only every maintenance and every reparation was written in a book, but every time the car was driven, it was written down with the amount of kilometers going from there to there, and that in a period from 1964 until 2015. And then you see the handwriting of the first owner becomes fuzzy, and shortly after the owner died, and a car collector could buy the car. So these are extremely special, extremely cars who carry personal stories, and that is what collectors often look for. Now, it's the combination of all these things that I've told about, all these layers and many more, but the time is limited. It's the combination that makes the car the most significant consumer object ever. And also UNESCO, cars are important in society, an important image as well. UNESCO recognizes the car as an industrial, a social, and a cultural heritage, and it supports the preservation of cars by now. Now, the question is, it has already been touched, but the question is, will that power, that status of the car survive in the 21st century? Sometimes it seems that new cars generate less passion as cars make technological progress and become better and safer. Some of the mentioned layers, the significations of cars, seem to fade away. For example, it's very simple, but the noise, the physical experience of a car disappears partly. Cars become kind of sterile boxes that we no longer control or even operate ourselves. The autonomous car is coming our way. Now, still, I strongly doubt that car passion will disappear. I've changed my mind a bit on that, but I used to think that car passion in the 21st century would disappear, but I doubt, and I doubt strongly. Until today, there is no object as emotional as a car. There is no rational reason at all to spend more than, let's say, 5,000 euros for a car, for a second-hand Kia, which does what it has to do, which is reliable, safe. You have such a car for 5,000 euro, but almost everybody who can spends more to a car. And what we see is that outside, we were talking about city centers. Outside city center, the need for individual and flexible mobility remains and will remain. Some researchers a few years ago, they said that millennials are less likely to buy cars. But what we see is that now that the millennials have children, they got children later than the previous generation. Now that they have children and families, doing everything with trains and buses and bikes appears to be very difficult. The shared car becomes more important. It's a fact, but it doesn't take over at all. The notion of a personal cocoon that I mentioned will stay, I guess. The need for a personal space will stay. And we have seen the last 10 years how making cars more individual remains a fact. Cars are personalized in the past, but still today. And it maybe became more important recently. People pay like hundreds of euros for some sticker on a Mini Cooper. Minis are highly individualized cars. The new Citroën DS is as well. Whereas people who buy Teslas new today, they often complain about the limited options for personalization. And there is a big aftermarket industry to make Teslas more personal. I think the electric car and the autonomous car who is about to come. Electric cars, apart from their fast acceleration, they cope today with a lack of character. But an electric car, in fact, as a platform, it's a sort of a skateboard with batteries and a tiny motor like this. There is a lot of freedom for design. And I guess that design, also new materials and new colors, can add the character again. There is room, I think, in the future for a lot of creativity. There's a Dutch designer, Niels van Rooij. He made a few years ago, you might have seen it, a one-off Tesla shooting brake. So he changed the skin of the car, and he made it in a beautiful shooting brake, of which one piece was made. On an exclusive scale, there seems to be a revival of what they call what is coach building, like in the early days of motoring, when people they bought a chassis, an engine, and a gearbox, and they went to a coach builder who made a body. Well, that's what Niels van Rooij does. In fact, he also designs unique one-off bodies for Ferraris and Rolls Royces. But not only on that very high level. I think there is room for lots of creativity in the more modest cars as well, and in the electric cars. On individuality, it might be interesting and make the link to architecture. Niels van Rooij, he also makes Land Rover Defenders, the icons, very individual, and he is quite successful in that. And he gets inspiration out of interior architecture. For example, in the use of materials, he doesn't use automotive leather, but for the new series of the Defender, he uses soft leather or Alcantara or other fabrics like used in interiors in a sofa, for example, or copper. They spray particles of copper on surfaces. And I saw an interesting Land Rover, a new Defender, which was delivered a few weeks ago, who has in its interior subtle hints to Curaçao, the island. And the reason for that, Niels van Rooij, he had a commission for that car to individualize that car. And he went to the clients at home and he saw a little painting of Curaçao, of the island. And he asked, what is this? Why is the painting here? And that seemed to be the place where the couple who commissioned the car, where they met each other. So he introduced the outlines of the island with a dot of the place where they met each other and the coordinates of that place where they met in the car. So what he basically did was getting the house and the interior of the house into into the car and be creative with that. And like that, you get extremely personal cars, an ongoing individualization of cars, and you can perfectly do that with an electric and a self-driving car in 10, in 20, in 30 years. So that's a way to keep cars special and exciting. And I used to think that cars would lose their excitement and their power in the 21st century. But the longer I talk to people and designers and creative people in the car business, the longer I believe that cars can keep their power. Okay, I'm gonna finish here. Yeah. I don't know if you have some more questions.
So great, thank you very much, Bert, for giving a nice ending to our symposium. And I think it was important for us to tie back to the object of the car as we set our course for the next half year. I was wondering if there are any questions for Bert, or reflections.
Well, I have a question about one of the earlier things you said, Bert. Thank you for showing your nice book. You mentioned that personal expression through the car is more important than doing it through clothing, right? And at the same time, these last things you mentioned, that there's limited options available, and also it reminded me of these statistics of car colors on the streets in the Netherlands, in particular. That the amount of the colors tend to become more gray and more black, and the colors that are out there are less colorful. So I don't know, what's your take on this? Is this something that's what does it say about a society that drives these, well, let's say a more boring selection of colors? Is that society, or is it the manufacturers' options? I don't know. What's your take on this?
I cannot support it with the research, but I think that's a matter of fashion. I think that changes every X years. Indeed, in the 70s, you used to have very colorful cars. Afterwards, the gray and white and the boring colors were everywhere. But I think recently, my gut feeling, I cannot support it, says that colorful cars are coming back again. Car manufacturers, they do a lot about, they think a lot about cars. They introduce new colors every year, and I think we have more color on the road again. But I might support. But to me, to my feeling, it's a matter of fashion. I don't believe that our societies has become more depressed or so.
Great, thank you.
Anything else? Oh yeah, Jim?
Maybe this is just kind of a thought more than a question, but I found it interesting that, especially at the end, you were talking basically about craftsmanship coming to this object that is so well known for being mass produced. But it's interesting that, like, we even before it became this kind of crafted item, people were able to create such a bond to something that is incredibly mass produced. And like, why is that? Because there's so many options within it? Because like there's the idea of it being unique comes through that story, but you could really do that with any item. And I guess it's, you were trying to say that it's this layeredness to it, but it's very contradictory to me, like the kind of the way that it's produced and then like how it's so or like the perceptions of mass production and like how we relate to that.
Yeah, there is a conflicting, and there is a certain, like, for example, I mentioned Tesla. For Tesla, it's very smart from their point of view to limit the freedom of choice in having a car and in buying a car. But if they don't do it, aftermarket players will do it. And on the other hand, you have like Mini, which already for more than 10 years, it's hard to see two perfectly equal Minis on the road. So they invest in that personalization. It's two movements, but for Tesla to be lean and mean as a car maker, it's smart, but their clients ask for more choice and more liberty and more individual cars.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, I would just like to thank Gabrielle, who needed to leave, Benedict, Christian, Evan, Bert, for a really, I think, a very inspiring kickoff. A lot of very nice presentations. So exactly what we were looking for. Thank you for helping us think together about how car design and architecture can intersect together. So we very much look forward to continuing a dialogue and hopefully finding some ways to bring us back together. If you would enjoy doing that throughout this project, I mean, it's always nice to kind of build up a dialogue over a course of time. So we look forward to touching base again after summertime. So thank you very much for engaging with us. So maybe we can just give a quick round of applause. So for, even though everybody's on mute. So thank you very much and have a wonderful